the militia was inaugurated even sooner than the army, the courts from November the 22nd, 1917, and the prisons. How, in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, could they delay with a new type of prison? That is to say that it was altogether impermissible to delay in the matter of prisons, whether old or new. In the first months after the October Revolution, Lenin was already demanding the most decisive draconic measures to tighten up discipline. And are draconic measures possible without prison? What new could the proletarian state contribute here? Lenin was feeling out new paths. In December 1917, he suggested for consideration the following assortment of punishments: confiscation of all property, confinement in prison, dispatch to the front, and forced labor for all who disobey the existing law. Thus we can observe that the leading idea of the archipelago, forced labor, had been advanced in the first month after the October Revolution. And even while sitting peacefully among the fragrant hay-mowings of Razliv and listening to the buzzing bumblebees, Lenin could not help but ponder the future penal system. Even then he had worked things out and reassured us. The suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the hired slaves of yesterday is a matter so comparatively easy, simple, and natural that it is going to cost much less in blood, will be much cheaper for humanity, than the preceding suppression of the majority by the minority. According to the estimates of émigré professor of statistics Kurganov, this comparatively easy internal repression cost us, from the beginning of the October Revolution up to 1959, a total of 66 million lives. We, of course, cannot vouch for his figure, but we have none other that is official. And just as soon as the official figure is issued, the specialists can make the necessary critical comparisons. It is interesting to compare other figures. How large was the total staff of the central apparatus of the terrifying Tsarist Third Department, which runs like a strand through all the great Russian literature? At the time of its creation it had 16 persons, and at its height it had 45. A ridiculously small number for even the remotest Cheka provincial headquarters in the country. Or how many political prisoners did the February Revolution find in the Tsarist prison of the peoples? All these figures do exist somewhere. In all probability there were more than 100 such prisoners in the Kresty prison alone, and several hundred returned from Siberian exile and hard labor, and how many more were languishing in the prison of every provincial capital? But it is interesting to know exactly how many. Here is a figure for Tambov, taken from the fiery local papers. The February Revolution, which opened wide the doors of the Tambov prison, found there political prisoners in the number of 7 persons, and there were more than 40 provinces. It is superfluous to recall that from February to July 1917 there were no political arrests, and after July the number imprisoned could be counted on one's fingers. Here, however, was the trouble. The first Soviet government was a coalition government, and a portion of the People's Commissariats had to be allotted, like it or not, to the left SRs, including, unhappily, the People's Commissariat of Justice, which fell to them. Guided by rotten petty bourgeois concepts of freedom, this People's Commissariat of Justice brought the penal system to the verge of ruin. The sentences turned out to be too light, and they made hardly any use at all of the progressive principle of forced labor. In February 1918, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Comrade Lenin, demanded that the number of places of imprisonment be increased, and that repression of criminals be intensified, and in May, already going over to concrete guidance, he gave instructions that the sentence for bribery must be not less than 10 years of prison and 10 years of forced labor in addition. That is a total of 20 years. This scale might seem pessimistic at first. Would forced labor really still be necessary after 20 years? But we know that forced labor turned out to be a very long-lived measure, and that even after 50 years it would still be extremely popular. For many months after the October Revolution, the prison personnel everywhere remained Tsarist. The only new officials named were commissars of prisons. The brazen jailers went so far as to create their own trade union, the Union of Prison Employees, and established an elective basis for prison administration, the only time in all Russian history. The prisoners were not to be left behind either. They, too, had their own internal self-government. Circular of the People's Commissariat of Justice, April the 24th, 1918. Prisoners, wherever possible, were to be brought into self-verification and self-supervision. Naturally, such a free commune of convicts, anarchical licentiousness, did not correspond to the needs of the dictatorship of the progressive class, and was of sorry help in purging harmful insects from the Russian land. And what could one expect if the prison chapels had not been closed, and our Soviet prisoners were willingly going there on Sundays, even if only to pass the time? Of course, even the Tsarist jailers were not entirely a loss to the proletariat, for after all theirs was a profession important to the most immediate purposes of the revolution. And therefore it was necessary to select those persons of the prison administration who have not become totally calloused and stupefied in the patterns of Tsarist prisons. And what does not totally mean? And how would you find that out? Does it mean they had forgotten God save the Tsar? Who can be used for work at the new tasks? Did they, for example, answer precisely, yes, sir, and no, sir, or turn the key in the lock quickly? And, of course, the prison buildings themselves, their cells, their bars and locks, although in appearance they remained exactly as before, in actual fact had acquired a new class content, a lofty revolutionary meaning. And, nevertheless, the habit of the courts, right up to the middle of 1918, of keeping right on, out of inertia, sentencing to prison, slowed the break-up of the old machinery of state in its prison area. In the middle of 1918, to be exact on July the 6th, an event took place whose significance is not grasped by everyone, an event superficially known as the suppression of the revolt of the left SRs. But this was, in fact, a coup d'etat of hardly any less significance than October the 25th. On October the 25th, the power, the government, of the Soviet of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies was proclaimed, whence the name Soviet power. But in its first month, this new government was very much beclouded by the presence in it of other parties besides the Bolsheviks. Although the coalition government consisted only of the Bolsheviks and the left SRs, nonetheless, in the membership of the All-Russian Congresses, the Second, Third, and Fourth, and of the All-Russian Central Executive Committees, VTSIKs, which they elected, there were still included some representatives of other socialist parties, SRs, Social Democrats, anarchists, popular socialists, etc. Because of this fact, the VTSIKs possessed the unhealthy character of socialist parliaments. But in the course of the first months of 1918, by a whole series of decisive measures, supported by the left SRs, the representatives of the other socialist parties were either expelled from VTSIK by its own decision and original parliamentary procedure, or else were simply not allowed to be elected to it. The last non-Bolshevik party, which still constituted one-third of the parliament, the Fifth Congress of Soviets, was the left SRs. And the time finally came to get rid of them, too. On July the 6th, 1918, they were excluded in toto from VTSIK and from the Council of People's Commissars. Thereby, the power of the Soviet of Deputies, by tradition called the Soviet, ceased to stand in opposition to the will of the Bolshevik Party and took the form of the democracy of a new type. Only on this historic day could the reconstruction of the old prison machinery and the creation of the archipelago really begin. In the clumsily high-flying language of Vyshinsky, the process, unique in the world, possessing genuine universal historical significance, of creating, on the ruins of the bourgeois system of prisons, those houses of the dead which were built by the exploiters for the workers of new institutions with new social content. A.Y. Vyshinsky, editor, From Prisons to Rehabilitative Institutions, Moscow, Sovetskaya Zakonodatelstvo, Publishing House, 1934, Preface. And the direction of this desired reconstruction had long since been understood. After all, Marx himself had pointed out in his Critique of the Gotha program that productive labor was the only method of prisoner correction. It was clear, of course, as Vyshinsky explained much later on, that what was meant here was not that kind of work which dries out the mind and the heart of a human being, but the miracle worker, which transforms people from non-existence and insignificance into heroes. Why is it that our prisoner must not chew the rag or read nice little books in a cell, but must labor instead? Because in the Republic of the Soviets there can be no place for forced idleness, for that forced parasitism which could exist in a parasitical society. For example, in Schlüsselburg. Such idleness as this on the part of prisoners would have very simply been contrary to the basis of the work structure of the Soviet Republic as defined in the Constitution of July the 10th, 1918. He who does not work does not eat. Consequently, if the prisoners were not set to work, they were, according to the Constitution, to be deprived of their bread ration. The Central Penal Department of the People's Commissariat of Justice, which had been created in May 1918, had immediately begun to send off to work the then-existing zeks, began to organize productive labor. After the Brest-Litovsk peace, the left SRs left the government, and the People's Commissariat of Justice was headed by Bolsheviks. But this legislation had been proclaimed only after the July coup, to be precise, on July the 23rd, 1918, in Temporary Instructions on Deprivation of Freedom. These instructions continued to exist during the whole course of the Civil War, right up until November 1920. Those deprived of freedom who are capable of labor must be recruited for physical work on a compulsory basis. One can say that the camps originated and the archipelago was born from this particular instruction of July the 23rd, 1918, 9 months after the October Revolution. Someone may enter a reproach that the birth was premature. The necessity of forced labor by prisoners, which was anyway quite clear for everyone by then, was further clarified at the 7th All-Union Congress of the Soviets. Labor is the best means of paralyzing the disintegrating influence of the endless conversations of prisoners among themselves, in the course of which the more experienced instruct the newcomers. Aha! So that's why. Soon after that, there began the communist Subbotniki, voluntary Saturdays, and that same People's Commissariat of Justice issued an appeal. It is essential to teach the prisoners to become accustomed to communist collective labor. In other words, the spirit of the communist Subbotniki was to be applied to the forced labor camps. And that is how that hasty epoch instantly heaped up a mountain of problems which it took decades to sort out. The bases of corrective labor policy were included in the party program at the 8th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, March 1919. The complete organizational structuring of the camp network throughout Soviet Russia coincided rigidly with the first communist Subbotniki, April the 12th to May the 17th, 1919. The decrees of VTSIK on camps for forced labor were issued on April the 15th, 1919, and May the 17th, 1919. Under their provisions, camps for forced labor were obligatorily created by the provincial Cheka in each provincial capital, if convenient, within the city limits, or in a monastery or on a nearby country estate, and also in several counties as well, although for the time being not in all of them. The camps were required to accommodate no fewer than 300 persons each, in order that the cost of the guard and the administration should be paid for by the prisoners' labor, and they were under the jurisdiction of the provincial penal departments. The early forced labor camps seem to us nowadays to be something intangible. The people imprisoned in them seem not to have said anything to anyone. There is no testimony. Literature and memoirs, when they speak of war communism, recall executions and prisons, but do not have a thing to say about camps. And nowhere, even between the lines, nowhere outside the text, are they implied. So it was natural for Mikhailo Mikhailov to make his mistake.
Where were those camps? What were their names? What did they look like?
The instruction of July the 23rd, 1918, had the decisive fault, noted by all jurists, that nothing was mentioned there about class differentiation among the prisoners. In other words, that some prisoners should be maintained in better conditions and some in worse. But it did outline the labor system, and that is the only reason we can get any picture of what they were like. The workday was set at 8 hours. Because of the novelty of it all, the hasty decision was made to pay the prisoners for all their work, other than camp maintenance, at 100% of the rates of the corresponding trade unions. Oh, what a monstrous thing! The pen can hardly bear to write it. They were being compelled to work by the Constitution, and they were also being paid according to the same Constitution. Logical enough. It is true that the cost of maintenance of the camp and the camp guard was deducted from their wages. For conscientious prisoners, there was a special benefit to be allowed to live in a private apartment and to come to the camp for work only. And release ahead of term was promised as a reward for special labor enthusiasm. And in general, there were no detailed instructions on the regimen, and every camp had its own. In the period of building a new governmental system, taking into account the great overcrowding of places of confinement, my italics, A.S. There was no time to think about the regimen in the camps. All the attention was being directed to unburdening the prisons. Something like that reads like a hieroglyphic from Babylon. How many questions immediately suggest themselves? What was going on in those wretched prisons? And what were the social causes of such overcrowding? And is one to understand the matter of unburdening the prisons to mean executions or dispatching prisoners to camps? And what did it mean by saying it was impossible to give any thought to the regimen in the camps? Did this mean that the People's Commissariat of Justice did not have time to safeguard the prisoner against the arbitrary actions of the local camp chief? Is that the only way this can be read? There were no instructions about the regimen, and in the years of the revolutionary sense of justice, every petty tyrant could do just as he pleased with the prisoners. From the meager statistics, all from that very same collection, Soviet Justice, we learn, in general, the work in camps was menial. In 1919, only 2.5% of the prisoners worked in workshops, and in 1920, only 10%. It is also known that at the end of 1918, the Central Penal Department, what a moniker, it makes the flesh creep, sought the establishment of agricultural colonies. It is known that in Moscow several brigades made up of prisoners were established to carry out repairs on water pipes, heating systems, and plumbing in nationalized buildings. And these apparently unescorted prisoners wandered about with monkey wrenches, soldering irons, and pipes through the corridors of government organizations and institutions, in the apartments of the bigwigs of those times, summoned by their wives by telephone to carry out repairs, and were never mentioned in any memoir, in any play, or in any film. But the forced labor camps were nonetheless not the first camps in the RSFSR. The reader has already read the term concentration camp, Konzlager, several times in the sentences of the tribunals, Part 1, Chapter 8, and concluded perhaps that we were guilty of an error, of making careless use of terminology subsequently developed. No, this is not the case. In August 1918, several days before the attempt on his life by Fanya Kaplan, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin wrote in a telegram to Yevgenia Bosch and to the Penza Provincial Executive Committee — they were unable to cope with the peasant revolt — lock up all the doubtful ones, not guilty, mind you, but doubtful, A.S., in a concentration camp outside the city. To this now forgotten woman was entrusted at this time via the line of authority of the Central Committee of the Party and of the Cheka as well, the fate of all Penza province. And, in addition, carry out merciless mass terror. This was before the decree. Only on September the 5th, 1918, 10 days after this telegram, was the decree on the Red Terror published, which was signed by Petrovsky, Kursi, and Bronch-Brujevich. In addition to the instructions on mass executions, it stated in particular, secure the Soviet Republic against its class enemies by isolating them in concentration camps. So that is where this term, concentration camps, was discovered and immediately seized upon and confirmed, one of the principal terms of the 20th century, and it was to have a big international future. And this is when it was born, in August and September 1918. The word itself had already been used during World War I, but in relation to POWs and undesirable foreigners. But here, in 1918, it was for the first time applied to the citizens of one's own country. The switch in meaning is easily comprehended. Concentration camps for POWs were not prisons, but a necessary precautionary concentration of the POWs. And so, too, for doubtful compatriots, extrajudicial precautionary concentration was now proposed. For an energetic mind which could visualize barbed wire surrounding prisoners who had not been tried, the necessary term was right at hand, concentration camps. And while the forced labor camps of the People's Commissariat of Justice belonged to the category of general places of confinement, the concentration camps were in no sense general places, but were under the direct administration of the Cheka and were maintained for particularly hostile elements and for hostages. True, in the future, prisoners would be sent to concentration camps by tribunals as well. But people never tried, kept pouring in automatically, sent there only on the basis of hostility. For escape from a concentration camp, the sentence was multiplied by 10, also without trial. This was in tune with the times, 10 for 1, 100 for 1. Consequently, if a prisoner had a 5-year sentence and escaped and was caught, then his sentence was automatically extended to 1968. For a second escape from a concentration camp, execution was prescribed, and of course was punctiliously carried out. In the Ukraine, concentration camps were created somewhat later, in 1920. But the creative thinking of our young Soviet justice did not content itself with this. Very shortly, even the concentration camps, which would seem to have had a firm class foundation, came to be considered insufficiently severe, insufficiently purposeful. In 1921, the Northern Special Purpose Camps were founded. Not for nothing was that label special attached to them. They had as their acronym SLON. The first such camps arose in Pertominsk, Kolmogori, and just outside Archangel itself. The magazine Solovetsky Ostrova, the Solovetsky Island, 1930, number 2-3, page 55, from the report of the Chief of Administration of SLON, Comrade Nogtev in Kem, when nowadays tourists are shown the so-called Camp of the Government of Tchaikovsky at the mouth of the Dvina River, one would have to be in the know to realize that this was one of the first northern special purpose camps. However, these places were evidently considered difficult to guard and unsuitable for large concentrations of prisoners, and the gaze of the higher-ups naturally fell on the nearby Solovetsky Islands, Solovki, where their already built-up establishments and their stone buildings, located 12 to 25 miles from the mainland, sufficiently close for the jailers and sufficiently distant to discourage escapees, with no communication with the mainland for half the year, a harder nut to crack than Sakhalin. And once Solovki had been selected and established, recollections of the forced labor camps, the concentration camps, and the special purpose camps vanished from the popular mind. Because Solovki was not kept secret in the 20s, and in actual fact ears buzzed with Solovki. They openly used Solovki to scare people with. They were publicly proud of Solovki. They had the brass to be proud of it. Solovki was even a symbol. There were as many jokes about it in vaudeville acts as you can imagine. After all, classes had already disappeared. Whither? And Solovki itself was soon to come to an end. Subscriptions to the internal camp magazine, the Solovetsky Island, were boldly sold throughout the Soviet Union. But the camp rootlets went deeper, deeper, and it is simply that we have lost count of their places and traces. There is no one now to tell us about most of those first concentration camps, and only from the last testimony of those few surviving first concentration camp inmates can we glean and preserve a little bit. At that time, the authorities used to love to set up their concentration camps in former monasteries. They were enclosed by strong walls, had good solid buildings, and they were empty. After all, monks are not human beings and could be tossed out at will. Thus, in Moscow, there were concentration camps in Andronikov, Novospassky, and Ivanovsky monasteries. In the Petrograd Krasnaya Gazeta of September the 6th, 1918, we can read that the first concentration camp will be set up in Nizhny Novgorod in an empty nunnery, and initially it is planned to send 5,000 persons to the concentration camp in Nizhny Novgorod. In Ryazan, the concentration camp was also set up in a former nunnery, Kazansky. And here is what they say about it. Imprisoned there were merchants, priests, and so-called war prisoners, as they called captured officers who had not served in the Red Army. But there was also another segment of the prisoner population which fitted into no simple category. For example, the Tolstoyan I.Y.V., whose trial we have already read about, was kept here. Attached to the camp were workshops, a weaving shop, a tailor shop, a shoemaker's shop, and there was also repair and construction work in the city, general work. In 1921, they were already calling it that. To this, the prisoners were taken by convoy, but those who worked as individual craftsmen, because of the kind of work they did, were allowed to go without convoy, and the citizens fed the latter in their homes. The population of Ryazan was very sympathetic towards the deprivees, as they were called. Officially, they were called not prisoners, but persons deprived of freedom. A passing column of them would be given alms, rusks, boiled beets, potatoes. And the convoy guards did not try to prevent their accepting such gifts, and the deprivees divided everything equally among themselves. At every step, customs not ours, ideology not ours. Those deprivees who were especially fortunate got positions in their specialized fields in institutions. For example, Y.V. on the railroad. They then received passes which permitted them to walk around the city, but they spent the night in camp. Here is how they fed them in a camp in 1921. Half a pound of bread, plus another half pound for those who fulfilled the norm, hot water for tea morning and evening, and during the day a ladle of gruel, with several dozen grains and some potato peelings in it. Camp life was embellished on the one hand by the denunciations of provocateurs and arrests on the basis of the denunciations, and on the other by a dramatics and glee club. They gave concerts for the people of Ryazan in the hall of the former Noblemen's Assembly, and the deprivees' brass band played in the city park. The deprivees got better and better acquainted with and more friendly with the inhabitants, and this became intolerable, and at that point they began to send the so-called war prisoners to the northern special purpose camps. The lesson of the instability and laxity in these concentration camps lay in their being surrounded by civilian life, and that was why the special northern camps were required. Concentration camps were abolished in 1922. This whole dawn of the camps deserves to have its spectrum examined much more closely, and glory to he who can, for all I have in my own hands is crumbs. At the end of the Civil War, the two labor armies created by Trotsky had to be dissolved because of the grumbling of the soldiers kept in them, and by this token the role of camps in the structure of the RSFSR not only did not diminish, but intensified. By the end of 1920, in the RSFSR, there were 84 camps in 43 provinces. If one believes the official statistics, even though classified, 25,336 persons, and in addition 24,400 prisoners of war of the Civil War, were held in them at this time. Both figures, particularly the second, seem to be understated. However, if one takes into consideration that by unloading prisons, sinking barges, and other types of mass annihilation, the figure had often begun with 0 and been reduced to 0 over and over, then perhaps these figures are accurate. According to the same source, by October 1923, at the beginning of the cloudless years of NEP, and quite a long time before the personality cult, there were being held, in 355 camps, 68,297 persons deprived of freedom, in 207 reformatories, 48,163, in 105 homes for confinement and prisons, 16,765, in 35 agricultural colonies, 2,328, and another 1,041 minors and sick persons. And there is another expressive figure. On the overcrowding of camps, for the number of those imprisoned grew more swiftly than the organization of camps. For each 100 accommodations for prisoners, there were, in 1924, 112 prisoners. In 1925, 120. In 1926, 132, and in 1927, 177. Whoever has done time there knows well what camp life was like, in terms of places on bunks, bowls in the mess hall, or padded jackets, if there were 1.77 prisoners for each allotted space. Year after year, other forms of existence for prisoners were also tried in a search for something better. For those who were not dangerous and not politically hostile, there were labor colonies, corrective labor homes from 1922, reformatories from 1923, homes for confinement, labor homes from 1924, labor homes for juvenile offenders. And for politically hostile prisoners, there were detention prisons from 1922, and from 1923 on, special purpose isolators, the former centrals and the future special purpose prisons, or TONs. The creators of these forms saw in them a bold struggle against making a fetish of prisons, common to all other countries of the world, including the former Russia, where nobody could think up anything at all except prisons and more prisons. The Tsarist government, which had transformed the entire country into one enormous prison, had developed its prison system with some kind of particularly refined sadism. On the threshold of the Reconstruction period, meaning from 1927, the role of camps was growing. Now, just what was one to think? Now, after all the victories? Against the most dangerous hostile elements, wreckers, the kulaks, counter-revolutionary propaganda. And so it was that the archipelago was not about to disappear into the depths of the sea. The archipelago would live. Until 1924, there were very few ordinary labor colonies in the archipelago. In those years, closed places of confinement were predominant, and they would not grow less later on. In his report of 1924, Krylenko demanded that the number of special-purpose isolators be increased, isolators for non-workers and for especially dangerous persons among the workers, in which category, evidently, Krylenko himself would turn up later on. This, his formulation, became a part of the corrective labor code of 1924. Just as in the creation of every archipelago, invisible shifts take place somewhere in important supporting strata before the picture of the world emerges before us, so here, too, very important shifts and changes in names took place, which are now nearly incomprehensible to our minds. At the very beginning, there was primeval chaos, and places of imprisonment were under the jurisdiction of 3 different institutions: the Cheka, Comrade Dzerzhinsky, the NKVD, Comrade Petrovsky, and the People's Commissariat of Justice, Comrade Kursky. In the NKVD at first, there was Gumzak, the chief administration for places of imprisonment, immediately after October 1917, and then GUPR, the chief administration for forced labor, and then once again GUMS, just as it is today in the 60s. In the People's Commissariat of Justice, there was the Prison Administration, December 1917, then the Central Penal Department, May 1918, with a network of provincial penal departments and even congresses of them, September 1920, And this was then made to sound better as the Central Corrective Labor Department, 1921. It goes without saying that such dispersal was to the disadvantage of the punitive corrective business, and Dzerzhinsky sought the unification of administrations. And, as it happened, at this point a little noticed merging of the Cheka into the NKVD took place. After March the 16th, 1919, Dzerzhinsky became the Commissar of Internal Affairs as well, and by 1922 he had also succeeded in transferring all places of imprisonment from the People's Commissariat of Justice to himself in the NKVD, June the 25th, 1922. And thus, GUMS of the NKVD kept ever expanding. Parallel to this took place the reorganization of the camp guards. First, these were the armies of the VOKHR, the Internal Guard Service of the Republic, and then VNUS, the Internal Service. And in 1919 they were merged into the corps of the Cheka, and Dzerzhinsky became the chairman of their military council as well. Nonetheless, up until 1924, there were complaints about the numerous escapes, the low state of discipline among the personnel. Probably there were drunkenness and carelessness. Their only interest lay in getting their wages. And it was only in June 1924 that by decree of VTSIK and the Council of People's Commissars, military discipline was introduced into the corps of convoy guards, and recruitment of them through the People's Commissariat for the Army and Navy was inaugurated. And furthermore, parallel to this, a central bureau of dactyloscopic registration and a central breeding establishment for service and tracking dogs were created in 1922. But at this same time, GUMZAC of the USSR was renamed GUITU, Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Institutions of the USSR, and then was renamed again GUITL of the OGPU, the Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps, and its chief simultaneously became the Chief of Convoy Troops of the USSR. And how much excitement there was, and how many of those stairs, offices, guards, passes, rubber stamps, seals, and signs there were. And from GUITL, the son of GUMZAC, derived our own Gulag. Chapter 2. The Archipelago Rises from the Sea. On the White Sea, where the nights are white for half a year at a time, Bolshoi Solovetsky Island lifts its white churches from the water within the ring of its bouldered Kremlin walls, rusty red from the lichens which have struck root there, and the greyish-white Solovetsky seagulls hover continually over the Kremlin and screech. In all this brightness, it is as if there were no sin present. It is as if nature here had not yet matured to the point of sin, is how the writer Prizhvin perceived the Solovetsky Islands. And to Prizhvin only, the monks themselves seemed sinful in the context of Solovki. It was 1908, and in accordance with the liberal concepts of the times, it was quite impossible to say an approving word about the clergy. And yet to us, who have survived the archipelago, those monks certainly seem angels, though having every opportunity of eating their bellies full, they, in the Golgotha Crucifixion Monastery, permitted themselves fish, itself a fast dish, only on the great holidays. Despite the opportunity to sleep whenever they pleased, they kept vigil nights on end and, in that same small monastery, day-long, year-long, and in perpetuity read the Psalter around the clock and prayed for all Orthodox Christians, living and dead. Without us, these isles rose from the sea. Without us, they acquired a couple of hundred lakes replete with fish. Without our help, they were settled by capercaillies, hares, and deer, while foxes, wolves, and other beasts of prey never ever appeared there. The glaciers came and went, the granite boulders littered the shores of the lakes. The lakes froze during the winter nights, the sea howled under the wind and was covered with an icy sludge, and in places froze. The northern lights blazed across half the sky, And it grew bright once again and warm once again, and the fir trees grew and thickened, and the birds cackled and called, and the young deer trumpeted, and the planets circled through all world history, and kingdoms fell and rose, and here there were still no beasts of prey and no human being.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 1, Side 2.
The glaciers came and went, the granite boulders littered the shores of the lakes. The lakes froze during the winter nights, the sea howled under the wind and was covered with an icy sludge, and in places froze. The northern lights blazed across half the sky, and it grew bright once again and warm once again, and the fir trees grew and thickened, and the birds cackled and called, and the young deer trumpeted, and the planets circled through all world history, and kingdoms fell and rose, and here there were still no beasts of prey and no human being. Sometimes the men of Novgorod landed there, and they counted the islands as belonging to their Obonezhskaya Pyatina. Karelians lived there, too. 100 years after the Battle of Kulikovo Field, and 100 years before the GPU, the monks, Savati and German, crossed the mother-of-pearl sea in a tiny boat, and came to look on this island without a beast of prey as sacred. The Solovetsky monastery began with them. After that, the cathedrals of the Assumption and of the Transfiguration arose. The Church of the Beheading on Sekirnaya Hill, and another score of churches, and another score of bell towers, and the smaller monasteries of Golgotha, the Trinity, Sabatyevsky, and Muxalmsky, and solitary retreats of hermits and ascetics in the remote locations. The labor of many went into the creation of all this, first of the monks themselves, and subsequently of the peasants belonging to the monastery. The lakes were joined by dozens of canals. Lake water was delivered to the monastery by wooden pipes. And the most surprising thing of all was a dike at Muxalma, 19th century, made from immovable boulders somehow set in place on the sand spits. On large and small Muxalma, fat herds began to pasture. The monks loved to tend animals, both tame and wild. The Solovetsky land turned out to be not only holy, but rich, too, capable of feeding many thousands. Specialists in the history of technology say that back in the 16th century, Philip Kolyachev, who had raised his voice against Ivan the Terrible, introduced a system of agricultural technology at Solovki that even 3 centuries later would have been respectable anywhere. In the vegetable gardens they raised plump, firm, sweet white cabbages. The stalks were called Solovetsky apples. All their vegetables were their own, and all of them were of the best quality. And they had their own greenhouses for flowers, where they even raised roses. They developed fisheries, catch from the sea and from the Metropolitan's fish ponds dammed off from the sea. In the course of centuries and decades, they acquired their own mills to mill their own grain, their own sawmills, their own dishware made in their own pottery works, their own foundry, their own smithy, their own bindery, their own leather shop, their own carriage shop, and even their own electric power station. Even their elaborately shaped bricks and their sea-going boats for their own use. They made all themselves. However, no development ever took place in the past, nor takes place in the present, and it isn't clear that it will ever take place in the future, without being accompanied by military thought and prison thought. Military thought. It was impermissible for some sort of feckless monks just to live on just an island. The island was on the borders of the great empire, and consequently it was required to fight with the Swedes, the Danes, the English, and consequently it was required to build a fortress with walls 8 yards thick, and to raise up 8 towers on the walls, and to make narrow embrasures in them, and to provide for a vigilant watch from the cathedral bell tower. And the monastery did have to defend itself against the English in 1808 and in 1854, and emerged unconquered. And in the conflict with the supporters of the patriarch Nikon in 1667, the monk Feoktist opened a secret entrance and betrayed the Solovetsky Kremlin to a boyar of the Tsar. prison thought. How glorious, good stone walls standing on a separate island. What a good place to confine important criminals, and with someone already there to provide guard. We won't interfere with their saving their souls, just guard our prisoners. How much of humanity's faith was destroyed by this double duty of Christian monasteries as prisons? Had Savatthi thought about that when he landed on the Holy Island? They imprisoned church heretics here, and political heretics as well. For example, Avrami Palitsin was imprisoned here. He died here. And Pushkin's uncle, P. Ganibal, for his support of the Decembrists. And the last ataman of the Zaporozhye Cossacks, Kolnyshevsky, a distant predecessor of Petliura, when he was already a very old man, was imprisoned here. And he was over 100 years old when he was released after serving a long term. The state prison in Solovetsky existed from 1718 on. Visiting Solovetsky in the 80s of the 19th century, the commander of the armies of the St. Petersburg military district, Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, found the military garrison there superfluous, and he removed all the soldiers from Solovetsky. In 1903, the Solovetsky prison ceased to exist. Incidentally, the ancient history of the Solovetsky monastery prison was the victim of a fashionable myth, disseminated only in Soviet times, during the period of the Soviet prison camp on Solovetsky, which deceived the writers of guidebooks and historical descriptions. And nowadays one can read in several books that the Solovetsky prison was a torture prison, that it had hooks for the rack, and lashes, and torture with fire. But all these were the appurtenances of interrogation prisons in the era before Empress Elizabeth, or of the Western Inquisition, and were not at all typical of Russian monastery dungeons in general, and were dreamed up here by an unscrupulous and also ignorant investigator. The old Solovetsky Island people remember him very well. It was the joker Ivanov who bore the camp nickname of the anti-religious germ. Formerly, he had been a lay brother attached to the Novgorod Archbishopric, arrested for selling church valuables to the Swedes. He got to Solovetsky in 1925 and hustled about to escape general work and death. He had made anti-religious propaganda among the prisoners his specialty, and of course became a collaborator of the ISCH, the Information and Investigation Section, which was named very candidly. But in addition, he excited the heads of the camp with his suggestions that many treasures had been buried here by the monks, and so they created a commission for excavations under his leadership. This commission kept on digging many months, but alas, the monks had cheated the psychological calculations of the anti-religious germ. They had buried no treasures in Solovetsky. At this point, to get out of the situation with honor, Ivanov went around explaining the underground workshops, storehouse, and defense installations as prison and torture facilities. The torture instruments naturally could not be preserved so many centuries, but the hooks, of course, for hanging up carcasses, were evidence that there had been a rack here. It was more difficult to provide a basis for the finding that no trace of 19th century torture had survived, so the conclusion was reached that during the past century the regime in the Solovetsky prison had been significantly relaxed. The discoveries of the anti-religious germ had come right at the most appropriate time, had in some degree reassured the disappointed administration, and were published in the Solovetsky Islands, and subsequently as a monograph in the Solovetsky printing shop, and by this means successfully muddied the waters of historical truth. This whole intrigue was judged all the more appropriate because the flourishing Solovetsky monastery had been very famous and respected in all Russia up to the time of the Revolution. But when power passed into the hands of the workers, what was to be done with these malevolent, parasitical monks? They sent commissars, socially tried and true leaders, and they proclaimed the monastery a state farm, and ordered the monks to pray less and to work harder for the benefit of the workers and peasants. The monks worked, and their herring, which was astonishing in its flavor, and which they had been able to catch because of their special knowledge of where and when to cast nets, was shipped off to Moscow to be used for the Kremlin tables. However, the abundance of valuables concentrated in the monastery, especially in the sacristy, troubled some of the leaders and overseers who had arrived there. Instead of passing into the workers' hands, that is, their own, these valuables lay there as a dead religious burden. And at that point, contradicting to a certain degree the criminal code, but corresponding in a very genuine way with the general spirit of expropriation of the property of non-workers, the monastery was set on fire on May the 25th, 1923. The buildings were damaged, and many valuables disappeared from the sacristy. And, the principal thing, all the inventory records burned up, and it was quite impossible to determine how much and exactly what had disappeared. And the anti-religious germ also referred to this fire, explaining the difficulty in finding nowadays material proofs of the former prison cells and torture apparatus. But without even conducting an investigation, what is our revolutionary sense of justice, sense of smell, going to hint to us? Who, if not the black gang of monks themselves, could have been to blame for the arson of the monastery wealth? So, throw them out onto the mainland and concentrate all the northern special-purpose camps on the Solovetsky Islands. The 80-year-old and even 100-year-old monks begged on their knees to be allowed to die on the holy soil, but they were all thrown out with proletarian ruthlessness, except for the most necessary among them, the artels of fishermen. They removed the fishermen from Solovki about 1930, and from that date on, the herring catches came to an end. No one could manage to find that particular herring in the sea any more, and it was as if it had completely disappeared. The cattle specialists on Muksalma, Father Methodius, the cabbage sorter, Father Samson, the foundry specialist. Yes, and other such useful fathers as well. They were allotted a corner of the Kremlin separate from the camp, with their own exit, the herring gates. They were christened a workers' commune, but out of condescension for their total stupefaction, they were left for their prayers the Onufriev church at the cemetery. And that is how one of the favorite sayings constantly repeated by the prisoners came true. A holy place is never empty. The chimes of bells fell silent, the icon lamps and the candle stands fell dark. The liturgies and the vespers resounded no longer. Psalms were no longer chanted around the clock. The iconostases were wrecked, though they left the one in the Cathedral of the Transfiguration. But on the other hand, courageous Czechists, in overcoats with super-long flaps which reached all the way down to the heels, and particularly distinctive black Solovetsky cuffs and lapels, and black-edged service caps without stars, arrived there in June 1923 to set up a model camp, a model of severity, the pride of the workers' and peasants' republic. Whatever special purpose might mean had not yet been formulated and set forth in instructions, but they had, of course, explained this orally at the Lubyanka to the chief of the Solovetsky camp, Eichmanns, and he, on arriving at the islands himself, had explained it to his closest assistant. Nowadays you could not astonish former zeks or even just plain people of the 60s with the story of Solovki. But just let the reader imagine to himself, if he will, a person of Chekhov's and post-Chekhov Russia, a person of the Silver Age of our culture, as they called the decade after 1910, brought up then, a bit shaken up by the Civil War, no doubt, but nonetheless accustomed to the kind of food, clothing, and mutual verbal communication customary among human beings. And then and there he enters the gates of Solovki, Kemperpunkt, the Kem transit camp. In Finnish, this place is called Begaraksha, that is, the habitation of witches. This transit camp in Kem was barren, without tree or bush, Popov Island, joined to the mainland by a dike. And the first thing he would see in that naked, dirty pen would be a quarantine company, for they organized the prisoners there in companies, they had not yet discovered the brigade, dressed in sacks, just ordinary sacks, the legs stuck out down below as if from under a skirt, and there were holes for head and arms. Impossible to imagine something like that, but what is there that our Russian ingenuity cannot overcome? This sack the newcomer would avoid as long as he had his own clothes, but before he had even managed to examine those sacks well, he would see the legendary Captain Kurilko. Kurilko, or Beloborodov, interchangeable with him, also came out to the prisoner transport column in a long Czechist overcoat with those frightening black cuffs which looked so utterly outlandish against the background of the old Russian khaki, like a herald of death. He jumped up on a barrel or some other suitable elevation, and he spoke to the new arrivals with unexpectedly strident rage. "Hey, attention! Here the Republic is not Sovietskaya, but Solovetskaya. Get this straight. No prosecutor has ever set foot on Solovetsky soil, and none ever will. Learn one thing. You have not been sent here for correction. You can't straighten out a hunchback. The system will be this. When I say stand up, you stand up. When I say lie down, you lie down. Your letters home are going to read like this. I'm alive, healthy, and satisfied with everything. Period." Struck dumb with astonishment, famous noblemen, intellectuals from the capital, priests, mullahs, and dark Central Asians listened to him and heard such things as had never before been heard or seen or read. And Kurilko, who had never made a splash during the Civil War, but who now, by this particular historical method, was writing his name in the chronicle of all Russia, got more and more worked up by each successful shout and turn of phrase, and kept formulating and spontaneously sharpening up still other new ones. And so, vainglorious and in full cry, and thinking maliciously inside himself, "You prisoners, where were you hiding when we were fighting against the Bolsheviks? You thought you could sit the whole thing out in your nooks and crannies, and now they've dragged you here? So that's for your shitty neutrality. And I'm friends with the Bolsheviks. We are people of deeds." Kurilko would begin his exercises. "Hello, first quarantine company. That's bad. It's not loud enough. Once more. Hello, first quarantine company. That's not loud enough. You have got to shout hello so loud that they can hear you over there on Solovki across the bay. When 200 men shout, the walls have got to fall down. Once again. Hello, first quarantine company." Making sure that everyone was shouting at the top of his lungs and was ready to fall in his tracks, exhausted by shouting, Kurilko began his new exercise. The quarantine company was to run around a post. "Legs higher, legs higher!" He was having hard going himself by now, like a tragedian before the final murder in the fifth act. And in the last hoarse croak of his half-hour of instruction, as a confession of the essence of Solovki, he promised those falling and those fallen, already prostrate on the ground, "I'll make you suck the snot from corpses." And that was just the first training session, intended to break the will of the newly arrived prisoners. And in the black, wooden, rotten, stinking barracks, they would be ordered to sleep on their sides, which wasn't so bad either, because that was for those prisoners whom the squad leaders would squeeze onto the bunks for a bribe, and all the rest would stand between the bunks all night, and anyone guilty of an offense would be set to stand, furthermore, between the latrine barrel and the wall. And these were the blessed years of 1923 and 1925, before the great turning point, before the personality cult, before the distortions, before the violations. And from 1927 on, there was this in addition, that Urki, thieves, would already be lying there on the bunks and snapping the lice off themselves into the midst of the standing intellectuals. While waiting for the steamship Gleb-Boki, they worked at the Chem transit camp, and some of them might be compelled to run around the post, hollering incessantly, "I'm a sponger, I don't want to work, and I get in the way of the others." The Gleb-Boki was named in honor of the chairman of the Moscow Troika of the Ogpu, a young man who never finished his studies. He was a student, he was a mining student, but passing marks just never came. This was a friendly epigram which appeared in the magazine Solovetsky Ostrova. The censor was stupid, and he didn't understand what he had passed. And an engineer who fell off the latrine barrel and spilled it on himself was not allowed in the barracks and was left outside to freeze in all his sewage. And sometimes the convoy would shout, "No laggards in the group, the convoy shoots without warning, forward march." And then, sliding the bolts of their rifles into position. "You trying to bug us?" And in the winter they would chase them out on the ice on foot, forcing them to drag the boats behind them and row across patches of water, and then, in open water, they would load them into the steamship's hold and shove so many in that before getting to Solovki, several of them would certainly die, without ever seeing the snowy white monastery inside the brown walls. In his very first Solovetsky hours, the newcomer might well experience the Solovetsky reception bath trick. He has already undressed, and the first bath attendant dips a swab into a cask of green soap and swabs the newcomer. The second one boots him somewhere down below, down an inclined board or a flight of stairs. Down there, a third bath attendant lets him, still confused, have a whole bucketful. And a fourth, right off, shoves him out into the dressing room, where his rags have already been tossed down from above, however they happen to land. In this joke, one can foresee all Gulag, both its tempo and the price of a human being. And that is how the newcomer swallowed the Solovetsky spirit, a spirit still unknown in the country as a whole, but which represented the future spirit of the archipelago created at Solovki. And here, too, the newcomer would see people in sacks, and also in ordinary free clothing, new on some and tattered on others, and in the special Solovetsky short pea-jacket made from coat material. This was a privilege. This was a sign of high position. That was how the camp administrative personnel dressed, with the so-called Solovchanki caps, made from the same kind of cloth. And suddenly you would see a person walking about among the prisoners in formal tail coat, and no one was surprised, no one turned around to look at him and laugh. After all, everyone came wearing what was his own. This poor chap had been arrested in the Metropole restaurant, and so there he was, slogging out his sentence in his tailcoat. The magazine, the Solovetsky Island, 1930, number 1, declared it was the dream of many prisoners to receive standard clothing. All values turn upside down with the years, and what was considered a privilege in the special purpose camp of the 20s to wear government-issue clothing would become an annoyance in the special camp of the 40s. There the privilege would be not to wear government-issue clothing, but to wear at least something of one's own, even just a cap. The reason here was not economic only, but was a cry of the whole epoch. One decade saw as its ideal how to join in the common lot, and the other how to get away from it. Only the children's colony was completely dressed, and the women, for example, were given neither underwear nor stockings, nor even kerchiefs to cover their heads. They had grabbed the old biddy in a summer dress. She just had to go on wearing it the whole Arctic winter. Because of this, many prisoners remained in their company quarters in nothing but their underwear, and no one chased them out to work. Government-issue clothing was so precious that no one on Solovki found the following scene either astonishing or weird. In the middle of winter, a prisoner undressed and took his shoes off near the Kremlin, then carefully handed in his uniform and ran naked for 200 yards to another group of people, where he was given clothes to put on. This meant that he was being transferred from the Kremlin administration to the administration of the Filimonovo branch railroad. They had dragged the railroad from Staraya Russa to Novgorod all the way over here. But if he had been transferred wearing clothes, those taking him over might not have returned the clothes or have cheated by switching them. And here is another winter scene, the same customs, though the reason is different. The medical section infirmary is found to be infectious, and orders are issued to scald it down and wash it out with boiling water. But where are the sick prisoners to be put in the meanwhile? All the Kremlin accommodations are overcrowded. The density of the population of the Solovetsky Archipelago is greater than that of Belgium. So what must it be like in the Solovetsky Kremlin? And therefore all the sick prisoners are carried out on blankets and laid out on the snow for 3 hours. When they have washed out the infirmary, they haul the patients in again. We have not forgotten, I hope, that our newcomer is a child of the Silver Age. He knows nothing of the Second World War or of Buchenwald. What he sees is this: the squad leaders in khaki pea jackets, stiffly erect, greet one another and the company leaders with salutes, and then they drive their workers out with long clubs, with staves, and there is even a special verb which everyone understands, meaning to stave. He sees that sledges and carts are drawn not by horses, but by men, several harnessed into one rig. And there is also another word, vridlo, an acronym meaning a temporary replacement for a horse. And from other Solovetsky inhabitants he learned things more awful than his eyes perceive. People pronounced the fatal word Sierkirka to him. This means Sekirnaya Hill. Punishment cells were set up in the two-story cathedral there, and here is how they kept prisoners in the punishment cells. Poles, the thickness of an arm, were set from wall to wall, and prisoners were ordered to sit on these poles all day. At night they lay on the floor, one on top of another, because it was overcrowded. The height of the poles was set so that one's feet could not reach the ground, and it was not so easy to keep balance. In fact, the prisoner spent the entire day just trying to maintain his perch. If he fell, the jailers jumped in and beat him, or else they took him outside to a flight of stairs consisting of 365 steep steps from the cathedral to the lake, just as the monks had built it. They tied the person lengthwise to a balan, a beam, for the added weight, and rolled him down, and there wasn't even one landing, and the steps were so steep that the log with the human being on it would go all the way down without stopping. Well, after all, for poles, you didn't have to go to Sekirka. They were right there in the Kremlin punishment block, which was always overcrowded. Or they might put the prisoners on a sharp-edged boulder on which one could not stay long either. Or, in summer, on the stump, which meant naked among the mosquitoes. But in that event one had to keep an eye on the culprit, whereas if he was bound naked to a tree, the mosquitoes would look after things themselves. And then they could put whole companies out in the snow for disobedience, or they might drive a person into the marsh muck up to his neck and keep him there. And then there was another way, to hitch up a horse in empty shafts and fasten the culprit's legs to the shafts. Then the guard mounted the horse and kept on driving the horse through a forest cut until the groans and the cries from behind simply came to an end. Before even beginning his life on Solovki, the novice was oppressed in his spirit simply by the fact of his endless 3-year term. But the contemporary reader would be much too hasty if he concluded that this was an open and above-board system of destruction, of death camps. Oh no, we are not so simple. In that first experimental camp, as in others afterward, and in the most comprehensive of them all, we never act openly. It is all mixed up, layer upon layer, and that is why it is so long-lasting and so successful. All of a sudden, through the Kremlin gates rode some daredevil astride a goat. He bore himself with importance, and no one laughed at him. Who was it, and why was he on a goat? This was Degtyaryov. In the past, he had been a cowboy, not to be confused with the 3 Degtyaryov, the chief of troops of the Solovetsky Archipelago. He had asked for a horse, but there were few horses on Solovki, so they gave him a goat. What had he done to deserve the honor? Because he had been a cowboy? No, not at all, because he was the manager of the dendrological nursery. He grew exotic trees, here, on Solovki. And so it was that from this horseman on a goat there arose a Solovetsky fantasy. Why should there be exotic trees on Solovki, where even the simple and reasonable vegetable economy of the monks had been destroyed, and where the vegetables were running out? Well, they were there because exotic trees at the Arctic Circle meant that Solovki, like the entire Soviet Republic, was remaking the world and building a new life. But where did the seeds and the funds come from? That's exactly the point. There was money for seeds for the dendrological nursery. There just wasn't any money for feeding the logging crews, where food was provided not according to norms, but according to available funds. And as for archaeological excavations, yes, we have a commission for excavations. It is important for us to know our past. In front of the camp administration building was a flower bed. In it was outlined a friendly elephant, the acronym for Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp being SLON, elephant. On the blanket on the elephant's back was the letter U, standing for administration. And that very same rebus was on the Solovetsky coupons, which circulated as the currency of this northern state. What a pleasant, cozy little masquerade. So it would seem that everything was really very nice here, that practical joker Kurilka had only been trying to throw a scare into us for nothing. And then, too, the camp had its own magazine, also called Slon. The first numbers came out in 1924, typed, and from issue number 9 on it was printed in the monastery printing shop. From 1925 on, the Solovetsky Islands had been published in 200 copies and had its own supplement, the newspaper Novye Solovki, New Solovki. We shall break with our accursed monastery past. And from 1926 on, subscriptions were accepted from the entire Soviet Union, and the run was a large one, and it was a big success. And almost immediately it was broken off. The regime showed it was not in such a joking mood. In 1929, after the big events on Solovki and a general turn in all camps in the direction of re-education, the magazine was started up once again and appeared until 1932. Censorship of the magazine was evidently superficial. The prisoners, according to Globokovsky, wrote joking verses about the GPU Troika, and they were passed. And then they were sung from the stage of the Solovetsky Theater, right in front of Troika chairman Gleb Boki himself. They promised us gifts, a bag full, Boki, Feldman, Vasilyev, and Bull. And this bigwig liked it. Well, after all, it was flattering. You hadn't even finished school, and here you were, going down in history. Then the chorus. All those who rewarded us with Solovki we do invite. Come take your leisure. Sit here with us for 3 or 5. You'll always remember them with pleasure. They roared. They liked it. Who was there to figure out that this was a prophecy? And impudent Shevchinsky, the son of a general who had been shot, then hung a slogan over the entrance gates. Solovki, for the workers and peasants. And this, too, was a prophecy after all, but it didn't go over well. They figured this one out, and they took it down. The actors of the dramatics troupe wore costumes made out of church vestments. They presented The Rails Hum. There were affected fox-trotting couples on the stage, the dying West, and a victorious red forge painted on the backdrop, us. It was a fantastic world. No, that scoundrel Kurilko had just been joking. And then there was also the Solovetsky Society for Local Law, which published reports and researches, for instance, about the unique 16th century architecture or the Solovetsky fauna, and they wrote in such detail and with such scholarly devotion, with such a gentle love for their subject, that it really seemed as if these idle, eccentric scholars had come to the island because of their passion for knowledge, not as prisoners who had already passed through the Lubyanka and who were trembling lest they end up on Sekernaya Hill or out under mosquitoes or fastened to the empty shaft behind a horse. Yes, the very Solovetsky beasts and birds, in keeping with the spirit of the students of local law, had not yet died out, had not been shot or expelled, were not even frightened. Even as late as 1928, a whole trusting brood of hares would come right up to the very edge of the road and watch with curiosity the prisoners being led off to Anzer. How had it happened that the hares had not been exterminated? They would explain it to the newcomer this way. The little beasts and birds are not afraid here because there is a GPU order in effect, save ammunition. Not a single shot is to be fired except at a prisoner. So all the scares were just a joke. But a shout comes in broad daylight in the Kremlin yard, where prisoners are crowded as thick as on Nevsky Prospect. Make way! Make way! And 3 foppish young men with the faces of junkies. The lead man drives back the crowd of prisoners not with a club, but with a riding crop, drag along swiftly by the shoulders a prisoner with limp arms and legs, dressed only in his underwear. His face is horrible, flowing like liquid. They drag him off beneath the bell tower. They squeeze him through that little door and shoot him in the back of the head. Steep stairs lead down inside, and he tumbles down them, and they can pile up as many as 7 or 8 men in there, and then send men to drag out the corpses, and detail women, mothers and wives of men who have emigrated to Constantinople, and religious believers who refuse to recant their faith and to allow their children to be torn from it, to wash down the steps. And right now, There on the stones over which they dragged them, in that part of the courtyard secluded from the Solovetsky wind, cheerful tourists who have come to see the notorious islands sock a volleyball hours at a time. They do not know. Well, and if they did know, they would go on socking anyway. But why like this? Couldn't they have done it at night, quietly? But why do it quietly? In that case, a bullet would be wasted. In the daytime crowd, the bullet had an educational function. It, so to speak, struck down 10 with one shot. They shot them in a different way, too, right at the Onufriev Cemetery, behind the women's barracks, the former guest house for women pilgrims. And in fact, that road past the women's barracks was christened Execution Road. In winter, one could see a man being led barefoot along it in only his underwear, through the snow. No, it was not for torture, it was just so his footgear and clothes should not go to waste. His hands bound behind his back with wire, a Solovetsky method which strangely was repeated with the corpses at Katyn Forest. Someone remembered, a matter perhaps of tradition, or was it personal experience? And the condemned man would bear himself proudly and erectly, and with his lips alone, without the help of his hands, smoke the last cigarette of his life. This was how you recognized an officer. After all, these were men who had gone through 7 years on different fronts. There was an 18-year-old youth, the son of the historian V.A. Potto, who, when he was asked his profession by a work assigner, replied with a shrug of the shoulders, machine gunner. Because of his youth in the heat of the Civil War, he had never managed to acquire any other. A fantastic world, and that's the way it is sometimes. Much in history repeats itself, but there also exist completely unique combinations, brief in duration and limited in place. One such example was our new economic policy, the NEP, and another was early Solovki. There weren't many Czechists there at all. Yes, and those who were may well have been in semi-punishment status. No more than 20 to 40 people held sway over thousands, many thousands. At the very beginning they hadn't expected so many, but Moscow kept sending and sending and sending. In the first half year, by December 1923, there were already 2,000 prisoners gathered there. And in 1928, in the 13th Company alone, the General Work Company, the last information on count-off would announce, the 376th, 10 in the unit. And what that added up to was 3,760 men, and the 12th Company was just as large, and the 17th, which dug mass graves in the cemetery, was even bigger. And in addition to the Kremlin companies, there were already others in Komandirovki, temporary work parties, Savatyevo, Filomonovo, Mukshalma, Trinity, and Zaychiki, the Zayatsky Island. By 1928, there were altogether about 60,000. And how many among them were machine gunners, veteran soldiers with long service records? And in 1926, the inveterate, habitual criminal element of all sorts began to flood in. And how were they all to be kept in check, kept from rebelling? Only by terror, only with Sekirnaya Hill, with poles, with mosquitoes, by being dragged through stumps, by daytime executions. Moscow kept pushing out prisoner transports without taking into consideration local forces, but neither did Moscow set limitations on its Czechists by hypocritical rules. Everything done to maintain order was a fait accompli, and it was really true that no prosecutor would set foot on Solovetsky soil. And the second method was a gauze veil with a fringe, the era of equality, and new Solovki. Self-guarding by the prisoners, self-supervision, self-verification, company commanders, platoon commanders, squad leaders, all from among the prisoners themselves, and their own amateur stage shows, and their own self-amusement. And beneath this terror and this fringe, what kind of people were there? Who? Genuine aristocrats, career military men, philosophers, scholars, painters, actors, lyceum graduates. Here are a few of the Solovki veterans whose names have been preserved in the memoirs of those who survived. Shirinskaya Shakhmatova, Sheremeteva, Shakovskaya, Fitstum, I.S. Delvig, Bagratuni, Asociani Erisov, Gosheron de la Fosse, Sivers, G.M. Osorgin, Klot, N.N. Bakhrushin, Aksakov, Komarovsky, P.M. Voyekov, Vadbolsky, Vonyelyatsky, V. Levashov, O.V. Volkov, V. Lodzino-Lozinsky, D. Gudovich, Tauber, V.S. Muromtsev, former cadet leader Nekrazov, was it he? The financier, Professor Odzerov, the jurist, Professor A.B. Borodin, the psychologist, Professor A.P. Shukhanov, the philosophers, Professor A.A. Mayer, Professor S.A. Askoldov, Y.N. Danzaz, the theosophist, Mayobus, the historians, N.P. Ansiferov, M.D. Priselkov, G.O. Gordon, A.I. Zeodzersky, P.G. Vasiyenko, the literary scholars, D.S. Likhachev and Zeitlin, the linguist I.Y. Anichkov, the orientalist, N.V. Pigulevskaya, the ornithologist, G. Polyakov, the artists, Bradz and P.F. Smotritsky, the actors, I.D. Kalugin of the Alexandrinka, B. Globakovsky, B.Y. Korolenko, a nephew. In the 30s, near the end of Solovki, Father Pavel A. Florensky was also there. Because of their upbringing, their traditions, they were too proud to show depression or fear, to whine and complain about their fate, even to friends. It was a sign of good manners to take everything with a smile, even while being marched out to be shot. Just as if all this Arctic prison in a roaring sea were simply a minor misunderstanding at a picnic, to joke, to make fun of the jailers. So there was an elephant on the money and in the flower bed. So there was a goat in place of a horse. And if the 7th Company was made up of actors, then its company leader had to be Kunst. And if there was a person named Berry Yagoda, then he, of course, had to be the chief of the berry dryer. And that is how those jokes came about which got past the ignoramus censors of the magazine. And those songs, Georgy Mikhailovich Osorgin used to walk around and mock, Comment vous portez-vous on this island? A lager comme a lager. And these jokes, this stressed and emphasized independence of the aristocratic spirit. These, more than anything else, irritated the half-beast Solovetsky jailers. One time, Osorgin was scheduled to be shot, and that very day his young wife, and he himself was not yet 40, disembarked on the wharf there. And Osorgin begged the jailers not to spoil his wife's visit for her. He promised that he would not let her stay more than 3 days, and that they could shoot him as soon as she left. And here is the kind of self-control this meant, the sort of thing we have forgotten because of the anathema we have heaped upon the aristocracy, we who whine at every petty misfortune and every petty pain. For 3 days he never left his wife's side, and he had to keep her from guessing the situation. He must not hint at it, even in one single phrase. He must not allow his spirits to quaver. He must not allow his eyes to darken. Just once, his wife is alive, and she remembers it now, when they were walking along the Holy Lake, she turned and saw that her husband had clutched his head in torment. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he answered instantly. She could have stayed still longer, but he begged her to leave. As the steamer pulled away from the wharf, he was already undressing to be shot. But still, someone did give them those 3 days. Those 3 Osorgin days, like other cases, show how far the Solovetsky regime was from having donned the armor of a system. The impression is left that the air of Solovki strangely mingled extreme cruelty with an almost benign incomprehension of where all this was leading, which Solovetsky characteristics were becoming the embryo of the great archipelago, and which were destined to dry up and wither in the bud. After all, the Solovetsky Islands people did not yet, generally speaking, firmly believe that the ovens of the Arctic Auschwitz had been lit right there, and that its crematory furnaces had been thrown open to all who were ever brought there. This book is continued on Cassette 2,
The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 2, Side 1.
After all, the Solovetsky Island's people did not yet, generally speaking, firmly believe that the ovens of the Arctic Auschwitz had been lit right there, and that its crematory furnaces had been thrown open to all who were ever brought there. But, after all, that is exactly how it was. People there were also misled by the fact that all their prison terms were exceedingly short. It was rare that anyone had a 10-year term, and even 5 was not found very often, and most of them were 3, just 3. And this whole cat-and-mouse trick of the law was still not understood, to pin down and let go, and pin down again and let go again, and that patriarchal failure to understand where everything was heading could not have failed entirely to influence the guards from among the prisoners also, and perhaps in a minor way the prison keepers themselves. No matter how clear-cut the declarations of the class teaching, openly displayed and proclaimed everywhere, that the sole fate the enemy deserves is annihilation, still it was impossible to picture to oneself the annihilation of each concrete two-legged individual possessing hair, eyes, a mouth, a neck, and shoulders. One could actually believe that classes were being destroyed, but the people who constituted these classes should be left, shouldn't they? The eyes of Russians who had been brought up in other generous and vague concepts, like eyes seeing through badly prescribed eyeglasses, could in no wise read with exactitude the phrases of the cruel teaching. Not long before, apparently, there had been months and years of openly proclaimed terror. Yet it was still impossible to believe. Here, too, on the first islands of the archipelago, was felt the instability of those checkered years of the middle 20s, when things were but poorly understood in the country as a whole. Was everything already prohibited? Or, on the contrary, were things only now beginning to be allowed? Age-old Russia still believed so strongly in rapturous phrases, and there were only a few prophets of gloom who had already figured things out and who knew when and how all this would be smashed into smithereens. The cupola had been damaged by fire, but the masonry was eternal. The land cultivated on the very edge of the earth had now been laid waste. The color of the restless sea was changeable, the lakes still, the animals trusting, the people merciless, and the albatrosses flew to the Bay of Biscay to spend the winter with all the secrets of the first island of the archipelago. But they would not tell their secrets on the carefree beaches, but they would tell no one in Europe. A fantastic world, and one of the main short-lived fantasies was this. Camp life was run by white guards, so Kurilko was not a chance phenomenon. Here is how it worked. In the whole Kremlin, the only free Chekist was the camp duty officer. Guarding the gates, there were no watchtowers, and patrolling the islands and catching escapees were up to the guard. Other than free people, they recruited into the guard ordinary murderers, counterfeiters, and other habitual criminals, but not the thieves. But who was there to take charge of the whole internal organization? Who was to run the administrative section? And who were to be the company and squad commanders? Not, certainly, the priests, nor the sectarian prisoners, nor the NEP men, nor the scholars, nor the students. There were no few students there, too, but a student's cap on the head of a Solovetsky prisoner was considered a challenge, an impudence, a black mark, and an application to get shot. It was former military men who could do this best. And what military people were there, other than the white officers? And thus, without any special deal, and hardly as the result of any well-thought-out plan, the Solovetsky cooperation of the Chekists and the White Guards began. Where were the principles of either? It is surprising, astonishing, only to someone used to social analysis on a class basis and unable to see differently. But to such an analyst, everything in the whole world is bound to be astonishing, because the world and human beings never fit into his previously set grooves. And the Solovetsky prison keepers would have taken the devil himself into their service, given that they had not been given red personnel. It had been decreed The prisoners should supervise themselves, in other words, oppress themselves. And who was there to whom this could better have been entrusted? And as for the eternal officers, the military breed, how could they forego taking into their own hands at least the organization of camp life, camp oppression? Just how could they stand aside submissively, watching someone else take charge incapably and mess everything up? We have already discussed earlier in this book the subject of what shoulder boards do to the human heart. And just bide your time. The day will come when the Red commanding officers will be arrested too, and how they will fight for jobs in the camp guards, how they will long to get hold of a turnkey's rifle just so as to be trusted again. I have already said that if Malyuta Skuratov had just summoned us. Well, and the White Guards must have felt much the same. All right, we're lost anyway, and everything is lost, so what difference does it make? Why not? Then, too, the worse the better. We'll help you make a hellhole out of Solovki, of a kind that never ever existed in our Russia, and your reputation will be all the worse. And then, all the rest of our boys agreed, so what am I supposed to do? Sit in the warehouse as a bookkeeper, like a priest? Nonetheless, the most fantastic Solovetsky story was not just that alone, but the fact that, having taken over the administrative section, the White Guards began to put up a fight against the Chekists. It's your camp on the outside, so to say, and ours on the inside. And it was the business of the administrative section to decide who worked where and who would be sent where. We don't meddle outside, so don't you meddle inside. Not very likely, that, for after all, the Information and Investigation section, the ISCH, had to have the whole inside of the camp speckled with its stoolies. This was the primary and the dreaded power in camp, the ISCH. And the security officers were also recruited from among the prisoners, the crowning glory of prisoner self-supervision. And that was what the White Guard Administrative Section, the ACH, took upon itself to do battle with. All the other sections, the cultural and educational section and the medical section, which would have such great significance in future camps, were both frail and pitiful here. And the economic section, headed by N. Frenkel, was also merely vegetating. It engaged in trade with the outside world and ran the non-existent industry. The paths of its future grandeur had not yet been plotted. So it was the two powers, the ISCH and the ACH, that fought it out. It began right at the Chem transit camp. The newly arrived poet, A. Yaroslavsky, approached the squad commander and whispered something in his ear. The squad commander bellowed out his words with military precision. "You were secret, so now you're public." The ISCH had its sekerka, its punishment blocks, its denunciations, its personal case files on the prisoners, and had control of liberating prisoners ahead of time and executions. It also was in charge of censoring letters and parcels. And the ACH controlled work parties, reassignment from island to island, and prisoner transports. The ACH exposed the ISCH stoolies in order to send them off on prisoner transports. The stoolies were pursued and fled and hid in ISCH headquarters, but they were pursued even there, and the ISCH rooms were broken into and the stoolies dragged out and hauled off to prisoner transports. It is interesting that the dawn of the archipelago thus began with the very same phenomenon to which the later special camps returned, with a blow struck at the stoolies. They were dispatched to Kondrostrov, to logging camps, and there the fantastic story went right on. In Kondrostrov, the exposed and ruined stoolies published a war newspaper entitled Stukhach Stuli, and in it, with sad humor, they further exposed in each other such sins as being over-pampered and the like. At this point, the heads of ISCH brought charges against the eager beavers of the ACH, lengthened their terms, and sent them to Sekirka. But the ISCH defense was complicated by the fact that an exposed informer, in the interpretation of those years, was considered a criminal. Article 121 of the Criminal Code disclosure by an official personage of information not to be disclosed, quite independently of whether disclosure took place intentionally or not, and in what degree the individual was actually an official personage. Consequently, exposed informers could not be defended and saved by the ISCH. Once caught, they had only themselves to blame. Kondrastrov was almost legitimized. The height of the hostilities between the ISCH and the ACH came in 1927, when the White Guards broke into the ISCH, cracked the safe, seized and published the complete lists of stoolies, who thereby became hopeless criminals. After that, however, the ACH steadily declined. There were ever fewer former officers, and the percentage of criminals continually rose. For example, the Chubarovtsi, as a result of the notorious Leningrad thugs trial. And gradually the administrative section was subdued. Yes, and then in the 30s, a new camp era began, when Solovki even ceased to be Solovki, and became a mere run-of-the-mill corrective labor camp. And the black star of the ideologist of that new era, Naftali Frenkel, rose in the heavens while his formula became the supreme law of the archipelago. We have to squeeze everything out of a prisoner in the first 3 months. After that, we don't need him anymore. But where are Savati and German and Zosima? Who was it who thought of living below the Arctic Circle, where cattle can't be bred, and fish can't be caught, and bread grains and vegetables don't grow? Oh, you experts at ruining flourishing lands, so soon, in 1 year or 2, to reduce the model agricultural enterprise of the monks to total and irreversible decline. How was it done? Did they plunder it and send away the plunder, or did they destroy it all right there on the spot? And to be incapable of extracting anything from the good earth while possessing thousands of unoccupied hands? Only the free people there had milk, sour cream, and fresh meat, yes, and the excellent cabbage of Father Methodius. And for prisoners there was rotten cod, salted or dried, a thin gruel with pearl barley or millet grits, and without potatoes. And there was never either cabbage soup or borscht. And as a result there was scurvy, and even the office workers' companies all had boils. And as for those on general work, their situation can be imagined. Prisoner transports returned on all fours from distant work parties. They actually crawled from the wharf on hands and knees. The prisoners were allowed to use up 9 rubles a month out of money orders from home, and there was a prison commissary in the chapel of German. And 1 parcel a month could be received, which was opened and inspected in the ISCH. And if you didn't bribe them, they would announce that much of what had been sent you was prohibited. Grits, for example. In the Nikolskaya Church and in the Uspensky Cathedral, the bunks rose, 4 tiers high. Nor was the 13th Company any less crowded in the block attached to the Preobrazhensky Cathedral. Imagine the crowded mass of prisoners at that entrance. 3,500 stampeding back to quarters on returning from work. It took an hour's wait in line to get hot water at the boilers. On Saturdays, the evening roll calls dragged out till very, very late at night, like the former religious services. They were very particular about hygiene, of course. Prisoners were forced to have heads clipped and beards shaved off. Also, all priests, one after another. In addition, they cut all the flaps off long clothing, particularly cassocks, of course. But they were a principal point of infection. The Czechists had greatcoats which reached right down to the ground. True, in the winter the ill and the aged, sitting there in underwear and sacks, could not make it to the baths from their company bunks. They were done in by the lice. They hid the corpses under the bunks so as to get the extra rations, even though that was not very advantageous for the living. The lice crawled from the cold corpses onto the warm, living survivors. In the Kremlin there was a bad medical section with a bad hospital, and in the remoter parts of Solovki there was no medicine at all. The sole exception was the Golgotha Crucifixion Monastery on Anzer, a penalty work party where they cured patients by murdering them. There, in the Golgotha Church, prisoners lay dying from lack of food and from cruelty, enfeebled priests next to syphilitics, and aged invalids next to young thieves. At the request of the dying, and in order to ease his own problem, the Golgotha doctor gave terminal cases strychnine. And in the winter, the bearded corpses in their underwear were kept in the church for a long time. Then they were put in the vestibule, stacked standing up, since that way they took up less space. And when they carried them out, they gave them a shove and let them roll on down Golgotha Hill. This is an unusual name for a church and monastery, not encountered anywhere else. According to legend, a manuscript of the 18th century in the State Public Library, Solovetsky Patarik, The Lives of the Solovetsky Fathers, on June the 18th, 1712, the monk-priest Job, during an all-night prayer vigil at the foot of this hill, saw a vision of the Mother of God in all the glory of heaven, and she said to him, "This hill from henceforth shall be called Golgotha, and on it shall be built a church and a monastery of the crucifixion, and it will be whitened by the sufferings of countless multitudes." That is what they named it, and they built it there, but for more than 200 years the prophecy was an empty one, and it did not seem likely that it would ever come true. But after the Solovetsky camp, one could no longer say this. At one time, in 1928, a typhus epidemic broke out in Kem, and 60% of those there died, but the typhus crossed to Bolshoi Solovetsky Island as well, and hundreds of typhus patients lay about in the unheated theatrical hall all at the same time. And hundreds likewise left there for the cemetery. So as not to confuse the count, the worker signers wrote the last name of every prisoner on his wrist, and some of those who recovered switched terms with shorter-term cadavers by rewriting the corpses' names on their own hands. And when many thousands of the Central Asian Basmachi rebels were herded here in 1929, they brought with them an epidemic characterized by black spots on the body, and all who fell ill with it died. It could not, of course, be the plague or smallpox, as Solovki people imagined it was, because those two diseases had already been totally wiped out in the Soviet Republic. And so they called the illness Asiatic typhus. They didn't know how to cure it, and here is how they got rid of it. If one prisoner in a cell caught it, they just locked the cell and let no one out, and passed them food only through the door, till they all died. What a scientific discovery it would be for us to establish that in Solovki the archipelago had not yet arrived at an understanding of itself, that the child had not yet guessed its own character, and then to observe how this character gradually manifested itself. Alas, it didn't work out that way. Even though there was no one to learn from, even though there was no one from whom to take an example, and even though it would seem that there was no hereditary element, nonetheless the archipelago swiftly discovered and manifested its future character. So much future experience had already been discovered at Solovki. The phrase, "to extricate from general work," had already come into existence. All slept on board bunks, but there were nevertheless some who had individual cots. There were whole companies in the church, but some prisoners were crowded 20 to a room, and there were other rooms with only 4 or 5. There were already some who knew their rights, to inspect the women's prisoner transports and pick out a woman. There were only 150 to 200 women for thousands of men, but later on there were more. A struggle for the soft, cushy spots through bootlicking and betrayal was already going on. They had already removed all the kontriki, counter-revolutionaries, from office positions, to which they were then restored because the habitual criminals only messed everything up. The camp air was already thick with continual ominous rumors. The supreme law of conduct had already become trust no one, and this squeezed and froze out the spiritual grace of the Silver Age. The free persons, too, had begun to enter into the sweetness of camp life and to taste its joys. Free families received the right to have the free services of cooks from the camp. They could always demand the services of woodcutters, laundresses, seamstresses, and barbers. Eichmanns built himself an Arctic villa. Potemkin, too, a former sergeant major of the Dragoons, subsequently a communist, a Chekist, and then the chief of Kem Transit Camp, lived lavishly. He opened a restaurant in Kem. His orchestra was recruited from conservatory musicians. His waitresses wore silk dresses. Gulag comrades who arrived from Rash and Moscow could feast and frolic in luxury here at the beginning of the 30s. They were served at table by Princess Shakhovskaya. and their check was only a formality, amounting to something like 30 kopecks, the rest being at the camp's expense. Yes, and the Solovetsky Kremlin, this was not the whole Solovki. It was the most privileged place in camp. The real Solovki was not even in the monasteries, where, after the socialists were sent away, work parties were established. The real Solovki was in the logging operations at the remote work sites. But it is precisely those distant backwoods that are most difficult to learn about nowadays, because those people did not survive. It is known that even at that time they did not allow the workers to dry themselves out in the autumn, that in winter they did not provide them with clothes or footgear in the deep snow, and that the length of the workday was determined by the work norm. The workday was completed when the work norm had been executed, and if it wasn't, there was no return to shelter until it was. And at that time, too, they discovered the device of new work parties, which consisted of sending several hundred people to totally unprepared, uninhabited places. But it would seem that in the first years of Solovki, both slave-driving the workers and allotting back-breaking work norms took the form of periodic outbursts, transitory anger. They had not become a vice-like system. The economy of the whole country was not based on them, and the 5-year plans had not been instituted. In the first years of SLON, there was evidently no firm external economic plan. Yes, and for that matter, there was no very careful calculation of how many man-days went into work for the camp as a whole. This was why they could suddenly switch with such frivolity from meaningful productive work to punishment, pouring water from one ice hole into another, dragging logs from one place to another and back. There was cruelty in this, yes, but there was also a patriarchal attitude. When slave-driving became a thought-out system, pouring water over a prisoner in sub-zero temperatures, or putting the prisoner out on a stump to be devoured by mosquitoes, had turned into a superfluity and a useless expenditure of the executioner's energy. There is an official figure, up to 1929 in the RSFSR, the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union, only 34 to 41% of all prisoners were engaged in work. And how could it have been any different in view of the fact that there was unemployment in the country at the time? It is not clear whether work at servicing and maintaining the camp itself was included in this, or whether it was only external work. At any rate, work at servicing and maintaining the camp itself would not have been enough to occupy all the remaining 60 to 65% of the camp prisoners. This proportion found its expression at Solovki as well. Clearly, throughout the 20s, there were no few prisoners without permanent work, partly because of the lack of anything to wear outdoors, or else performing purely formal duties. That first year of the first 5-year plan, which shook up the entire country, shook up Solovki as well. The new chief of SLON, appointed in 1930, Nogtev, the same chief of the Solovetsky monastery who had shot down the socialists, reported, to the accompaniment of a whisper of astonishment in an astounded hall, to the free inhabitants of the city of Kem, these figures. Not counting its logging operations for its own use, which had grown at quite exceptional tempos, USLON had filled external orders alone for the Railroad Timber Trust and the Karelian Timber Trust. In 1926, 63,000 rubles. In 1929, 2,355,000 rubles, 37 times greater. And in 1930, the total had jumped another 3 times. Road construction for the Karelian Murmansk region had been carried out in 1926 in the amount of 105,000 rubles, and in 1930, 6 million, increased by 57 times. And that is how the once remote Solovki, where they didn't know how to make full use of the prisoners, came to an end. The miracle worker work rushed in to assist. Solovki was created via Kem Transit Camp, and via Kem Transit Camp Solovki, in its maturity, began at the end of the 20s to spread back to the mainland. And the worst thing that could now befall a prisoner was to be sent out on these work parties on the mainland. Previously, the sole mainland points belonging to Solovki were Soroka and Sumsky Posad, coastal appurtenances of the monasteries. But now the advancing SLON forgot its monastery boundaries. From Kem, through the swamps to the west, to Ukhtar, the prisoners began to build a dirt road, which had at one time been considered almost impossible to build. In the summer they drowned, and in the winter they froze. The Solovetsky prisoners feared this road to the point of panic, and for a long time the threat echoed and re-echoed over the Kremlin courtyard. "What? You're asking for Ukhtar?" The second, similar road was from Medvezhegorsk to Palandovsky. On its route, the Chekist Gazhidze ordered explosives set into a cliff, and then sent KRs up on the cliff, and through his binoculars watched them being blown up. They say that in December 1928, on Krasnaya Gorka in Karelia, the prisoners were left to spend the night in the woods as punishment for failure to fulfill the assigned norm of work, and 150 men froze to death there. This was a standard Solovetsky trick. Hard to doubt the story. There is somewhat greater difficulty in believing another story, that in February 1929, on the Kem-Ukhtar road near the tiny settlement of Kut, a company consisting of approximately 100 prisoners was driven into the bonfire for failure to fulfill the work norm, and burned alive. I was told this story by one solitary person only, who had been close by, Professor D.P. Kalistov, an Old Zolovetsky veteran, who died recently, but I was never able to collect any corroborative testimony. And maybe no one ever will collect any, and there is also much else about which no one is ever going to collect testimony, even one single solitary report. But after all, why shouldn't people who freeze other people to death and who blow them up in an explosion burn them alive, because the technology involved was no more complex? Let those who prefer to put their faith in the printed word rather than in living people read about the road building by this very same USLON and by the very same Zex in the very same year, except that the area was the Kola Peninsula. With great difficulty we built the dirt road along the valley of the Belaya River, along the shore of Lake Budyarov to Kukisvumchor, near the present Apatiti, for a distance of 17 miles, paving a swamp. And what would you think it was paved with? The answer fairly leaps to the tip of the tongue, doesn't it? But it can't be set down on paper. With logs and sand embankments, leveling the capricious configuration of the crumbling slopes of the stony mountains. And then USLON built a railroad there in addition. 7 miles in a single winter month. And why in 1 month? And why couldn't it have been postponed till summer? The task seemed insuperable, 400,000 cubic yards of excavations. North of the Arctic Circle, in the middle of winter, and they called it Earth. It was harder than any granite. Performed solely by hand, with pick, crowbar, and spade. And did they at least have mittens? The work was delayed by the need for a multitude of bridges. Work went on for 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, and the Arctic night was sliced by the light of incandescent kerosene lanterns as clearings were cut through the pine woods and stumps were dug out in the midst of snowstorms which covered the roadbed deeper than the height of a man. Now go back and read that over, then close your eyes and picture the scene. You are a helpless city dweller, a person who sighs and pines like a character in Chekhov. And there you are in that icy hell. Or you are a Turkmenian in your embroidered skullcap, your Tiobetaika, out there in the night blizzard, digging out stumps. This was in those best and brightest 20s, before any personality cult, when the white, yellow, black, and brown races of the earth looked upon our country as the torch-bearer of freedom. Oh, Bertrand Russell, oh, Hewlett Johnson, where, oh, where was your flaming conscience at that time? This was during those self-same years when they used to sing amusing ditties about Solovki from the nation's vaudeville stages. And so, imperceptibly, via work parties, the former concept of the special purpose camp, totally isolated on its islands, dissolved, and the archipelago, born and come to maturity on Solovki, began its malignant advance through the nation. A problem arose. The territory of this country had to be spread out in front of the archipelago, but without allowing the archipelago to conquer it, to distract it, to take it over, or assimilate it to itself. Every little island and every little hillock of the archipelago had to be encircled by a hostile, stormy Soviet seascape. It was permissible for the two worlds to interlock in separate strata, but not to intermingle. And this Nogtev report, which evoked a whisper of astonishment, was, after all, articulated so as to initiate a resolution by the workers of Chem, which would then appear in the newspapers and be posted in the villages. The intensifying class struggle inside the USSR, and the danger of war which is increasing as never before. In our country, things are always increasing or intensifying as never before. They never ever get weaker. Require of the organs of the OGPU and USLON even greater solidarity with the workers, vigilance. By organization of public opinion, a struggle is to be waged against free persons rubbing elbows with prisoners, against concealment of escapees, against purchase of stolen and government property from prisoners, and against all kinds of malicious rumors which are being disseminated by class enemies about USLON. And just what were those malicious rumors? That people were imprisoned in camp and without cause. And one more point. It is the duty of every person to inform. Disgusting free people. They were making friends with Zeks. They were concealing escapees. This was a terrible danger. If an end was not put to it, there would be no archipelago, and the country would be a goner, and the revolution would be a goner. And therefore, to combat malicious rumors, honest progressive rumors were spread, that the camps were populated by murderers and rapists, that every escapee was a dangerous bandit. Lock your doors, be frightened, save your children, catch them, turn them in, help the work of the OGPU, and if you knew of someone who did not help thus, inform. Now, with the spread of the archipelago, escapes multiplied. There was the hopelessness of the logging and road-building work parties, yet at the same time there was a whole continent beneath the feet of the escapees. So there was hope in spite of all. However, escape plans had excited the Solovetsky prisoners even at a time when SLON was still on a totally isolated island. The innocents believed in the end of their 3-year term. But those who were foresighted had already grasped the truth, that they would never see freedom in either 3 or 23 years, and that meant freedom lay only in escape. But how could they escape from Solovetsky? For half a year the sea was frozen over, but not solidly, and in places there was open water, and the snowstorms raged, and the frost bit hard, and things were enveloped in mists and darkness. And in the spring, and for a large part of the summer, there were the long white nights with clear visibility over long distances for the patrolling cutters. And it was only when the nights began to lengthen in the late summer and the autumn that the time was right. Not for prisoners in the Kremlin, of course, but for those who were out in work parties where a prisoner might have freedom of movement and time to build a boat or a raft near the shore and to cast off at night, even just riding off on a log for that matter, and strike out at random, hoping above all to encounter a foreign ship. The bustle among the guards and the embarkation of the cutters would reveal to the islanders the fact of an escape, and there would be a tremor of rejoicing among the prisoners, as if they were themselves escaping. They would ask in a whisper, had he been caught yet? Had he been found yet? Many must have drowned without ever getting anywhere. One or another of them reached the Karelian shore, perhaps, and if he did, was more silent than the grave. And there was a famous escape from Chem to England. This particular daredevil, his name is unknown to us, that's the breadth of our horizon, knew English and concealed it. He managed to get assigned to loading timber in Chem, and he's told his story to the Englishmen. The convoy discovered he was missing and delayed the ship for nearly a whole week and searched it several times without finding the fugitive. What happened was that whenever a search party started from the shore, they lowered him overboard on the opposite side on the anchor chain, where he clung under water with a breathing pipe held in his teeth. An enormous fine had to be paid for delaying the ship, so they finally decided to take a chance and let the ship go, thinking that perhaps the prisoner had drowned. Then a book came out in England, even it would seem in more than one printing. Evidently, An Island Hell by S.A. Malsagoff. And is this another book you have not read, Sir Bertrand Russell? This book astounded Europe, and no doubt they accused its fugitive author of exaggerating, for after all, the friends of the new society could not permit themselves to believe this slanderous volume. Because it contradicted what was already well known. The newspaper Rotefana had described Solovetsky as a paradise, and we hope that the paper's correspondents spent time in the archipelago later on. And it also contradicted those albums about Solovetsky disseminated by Soviet diplomatic missions in Europe. Fine quality paper and true-to-life photographs of the cozy monk's cells. Nadezhda Solovetsky, our communist in Austria, received this album from the Soviet mission in Vienna and indignantly denounced the slander about Solovetsky current in Europe. And at the very same time, the sister of her future husband was in fact imprisoned at Solovetsky, and she herself was predestined to be walking single file in the Yaroslavl isolator in 2 years' time. Slander or not, the breach had been a misfortune. And so a commission of VTSIK, under the chairmanship of the conscience of the party, Comrade Solz, was sent off to find out what was going on there on those Solovetsky Islands, for of course they didn't have the least idea. But in fact, the commission merely rode along the Murmansk Railroad, and they didn't do much of anything even there. And they thought it right to send to the islands, no, to implore to go there, none less than the great proletarian writer Maxim Gorky, who had recently returned to live in the proletarian fatherland. His testimony would be the very best refutation of that repulsive foreign forgery. The rumor reached Solovetsky before Gorky himself, and the prisoners' hearts beat faster, and the guards hustled and bustled. One has to know prisoners in order to imagine their anticipation. The Falcon, the stormy petrel, was about to swoop down upon the nest of injustice, violence, and secrecy. The leading Russian writer, he will give them hell. He will show them. He, the father, will defend. They awaited Gorky almost like a universal amnesty. The chiefs were alarmed, too. As best they could, they hid the monstrosities and polished things up for show. Transports of prisoners were sent from the Kremlin to distant work parties, so that fewer would remain there. Many patients were discharged from the medical section, and the whole thing was cleaned up. And they set up a boulevard of fir trees without roots, which were simply pushed down into the ground. They only had to last a few days before withering. It led to the children's colony, opened just 3 months previously, and the pride of USLON, where everyone had clothes, and where there were no socially hostile children, and where, of course, Gorky would be very interested in seeing how juveniles were being re-educated and saved for a future life under socialism. Only in Kem was there an oversight. On Popov Island, the ship Gleb Boki was being loaded by prisoners in underwear and sacks when Gorky's retinue appeared out of nowhere to embark on that steamer. You inventors and thinkers, here is a worthy problem for you, given that, as the saying goes, every wise man has enough of the fool in him. A barren island, not one bush, no possible cover, and right there, at a distance of 300 yards, Gorky's retinue has shown up. Your solution? Where can this disgraceful spectacle, these men dressed in sacks, be hidden? The entire journey of the great humanist will have been for naught if he sees them now. Well, of course, he will try hard not to notice them, but help him. Drown them in the sea. They will wallow and flounder. Bury them in the earth. There's no time. No, only a worthy son of the archipelago could find a way out of this one. The worker signer ordered, "Stop work. Close ranks. Still closer. Sit down on the ground. Sit still." And a tarpaulin was thrown over them. "Anyone who moves will be shot." And the former stevedore Maxim Gorky ascended the ship's ladder and admired the landscape from the steamer for a full hour till sailing time. And he didn't notice. That was June the 20th, 1929. The famous writer disembarked from the steamer in Prosperity Gulf. Next to him was his fiancée, all dressed in leather, a black leather service cap, a leather jacket, leather riding breeches and high, narrow boots, a living symbol of the Ogpu, shoulder to shoulder with Russian literature. Surrounded by the commanding officer corps of the GPU, Gorky marched with long, swift strides through the corridors of several barracks. The room doors were all wide open, but he entered hardly any. In the medical section, doctors and nurses in clean robes formed up for him in 2 rows, but he didn't even look around and went on out. From there, the Chekists of Uzlon fearlessly took him to Serkirka, and what was there to see there? It turned out that there was no overcrowding in the punishment cells, and, the main point, no Poles, none at all. Thieves sat on benches. There was already a multitude of thieves in Solovki, and they were all reading newspapers. None of them was so bold as to get up and complain, but they did think up one trick. They held the newspapers upside down, and Gorky went up to one of them and in silence turned the newspaper right side up. He had noticed it. He had understood. He would not abandon them. He would defend them. The Gaipai Ushnitsa, the GPU woman agent, who was Gorky's companion, also exercised her pen, and here is what she wrote. We are getting to know the life of the Solovetsky camp. I went to the museum. All of us went to Sekir Hill. From there, it was a wonderful view of the lake. The water in the lake was coldly dark blue in color, and around the lake was a forest. It seemed to be bewitched, and as the light shifted, the tops of the pines flared up, and the mirror-like lake became fiery. Silence and astonishing beauty. On the way back, we passed the peat workings. In the evening, we listened to a concert. We dined on local Solovetsky herring, small but surprisingly tender and tasty. They melted in the mouth. From M. Gorky and Son, Moscow, Nauka, 1971, page 276. They went to the children's colony. How decent everything was there. Each was on a separate cot with a mattress. They all crowded around in a group, and all of them were happy. And all of a sudden, a 14-year-old boy said, Listen here, Gorky. Everything you see here is false. Do you want to know the truth? Shall I tell you? Yes, nodded the writer. Yes, he wanted to know the truth. Oh, you bad boy, why do you want to spoil the just recently arranged prosperity of the literary patriarch? A palace in Moscow, an estate outside Moscow. And so everyone was ordered to leave, including the children and the accompanying Guy Payushnishki, and the boy spent an hour and a half telling the whole story to the lanky old man. Gorky left the barracks streaming tears. He was given a carriage to go to dinner at the villa of the camp chief, and the boys rushed back into the barracks. Did you tell him about the mosquito treatment? Yes. Did you tell him about the pole torture? Yes. Did you tell him about the prisoners hitched up instead of horses? Yes. And how they roll them down the stairs, and about the sacks, and about being made to spend the night in the snow? And it turned out that the truth-loving boy had told all. But we don't even know his name. On June the 22nd, in other words, after his chat with the boy, Gorky left the following inscription in the visitor's book, which had been specially made for this visit. I am not in a state of mind to express my impressions in just a few words. I wouldn't want, yes, and I would likewise be ashamed, to permit myself banal praise of the remarkable energy of people who, while remaining vigilant and tireless sentinels of the revolution, are able, at the same time, to be remarkably bold creators of culture.
This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 2, Side 2.
I am not in a state of mind to express my impressions in just a few words. I wouldn't want, yes, and I would likewise be ashamed, to permit myself banal praise of the remarkable energy of people who, while remaining vigilant and tireless sentinels of the revolution, are able, at the same time, to be remarkably bold creators of culture. On June the 23rd, Gorky left Solovki. Hardly had his steamer pulled away from the pier than they shot the boy. Oh, great interpreter of the human heart, great connoisseur of human beings, How could he have failed to take the boy along with him? And that is how faith in justice was instilled in the new generation. They try to tell us that up there on the summit, the chief of literature made excuses that he didn't want to publish praise of USLON. But how can that be, Alexei Maximovich, with bourgeois Europe looking on? But right now, right at this very moment, which is so dangerous and so complicated, and the camp regimen there, we'll change it. We'll change the camp regimen. And he did publish his statement, and it was republished over and over in the big free press, both our own and that of the West, in the name of the Falcon and Stormy Petrel, claiming it was nonsense to frighten people with Solovetsky, and that prisoners lived remarkably well there, and were being well reformed. And, descending into his coffin, he gave his blessing to the archipelago. I used to ascribe Gorky's pitiful conduct after his return from Italy and right up to his death to his delusions and folly. But his recently published correspondence of the 20s provides a reason for explaining it on lesser grounds, material self-interest. In Sorrento, Gorky was astonished to discover that no world fame had accrued to him, nor money either. He had a whole palace full of servants. It became clear that both for money and to revive his fame, he had to return to the Soviet Union and accept all the attached conditions. He thereby became Yagoda's voluntary prisoner, and Stalin killed him to no purpose, out of excessive caution. Gorky would have sung hymns of praise to 1937, too. And as for the camp regimen, they kept their promise. The regimen was reformed. Now, in the 11th Punishment Company, they were kept standing for a week, packed against one another. A commission came to Solovetsky, and it wasn't a Salts commission either, but an investigative, punitive commission. It delved into things, and, with the help of the local ISCH, came to understand that all the cruelties of the Solovetsky camp regime were the work of the White Guards of the ACH, and of the aristocrats in general, and partly of the students, too, those very same students who since the past century had been setting St. Petersburg on fire. At this point, the silly, unsuccessful escape attempt of the insane Kozhevnikov, former minister of the Far Eastern Republic, together with Shevchinsky and Degtyaryov, the cowboy, was inflated into an enormous and fantastic plot by the White Guards, who were allegedly scheming to seize a steamship and sail away. And they began to make arrests, and even though no one confessed to such a plot, the case kept on growing, as did the arrests. They had set themselves a figure of 300, and they reached it. And on the night of October the 15th, 1929, having dispersed everyone and locked them up in quarters, the holy gates, ordinarily kept locked, were opened so as to shorten the route to the cemetery. They kept taking groups there the whole night long, and each group was accompanied by the desperate howling of the dog Black, who had been tied up somewhere and who suspected that his master Bagratuni was being led off in each new group. The prisoners could count the number of groups being taken off by the number of periods of howling, but because of a strong wind, the shots themselves were less audible. This howling had such an impact on the executioners that the next day they shot not only Black, but also all the other dogs on account of Black. The executioners were the 3 fancy Dan junkies, plus the chief of the camp guard, Degtyaryov, and, no less, the chief of the cultural and educational section, Uspensky. The combination was only superficially astonishing. This Uspensky's biography is what is called typical, in other words, not the most common, but concentrating in itself the essence of the epoch. He was born the son of a priest, and that is what he was when the revolution caught up with him. What did he have to look forward to? Security questionnaires, restrictions, exile, persecution. And there is no possible way to erase this from one's record, no possible way to change one's father. But no, Uspensky discovered there was a way. He killed his own father, and declared to the authorities that he had done it out of class hatred. This was a healthy attitude, and almost not murder at all. He was given an easy sentence, and he immediately rose in the camp in the cultural and educational line of work, and was soon liberated. And here we come upon him as the free chief of the cultural and educational section, the KVCH, of Solovetsky. And as far as these executions are concerned, It is not known whether he volunteered or whether they suggested he reaffirm his class position. By night's end, at any rate, he was seen washing off the blood-soaked tops of his boots, one after the other, over a wash-basin. They were drunk and careless, and in the morning the enormous pit, only lightly covered over, was still stirring and moving. Throughout October, and during November too, they brought additional groups from the mainland for execution. In one of them, Kurilko was shot. Somewhat later, the entire cemetery was levelled by the prisoners, while a band played in the background. After those executions, the chief of SLON was replaced. Zarin came to replace Achmans, and it is considered that a new era of Solovetsky legality was thereby established. However, here is what it was like. In the summer of 1930, they brought to Solovki several dozen religious sectarians who rejected anything that came from Antichrist. They refused to accept any documents, including passports, and they refused to sign for anything or to handle any money. At their head was a grey-bearded old man of 80, blind, and bearing a long staff. Every enlightened person could clearly see that these sectarians could never ever enter into socialism, because that required having a great deal to do with papers, and that therefore the best thing for them to do was to die. And so they sent them off to Malizayatsky Island, the smallest in the entire Solovetsky Archipelago, sandy, unforested desert, containing a summer hut of the former monk fishermen. And they expressed willingness to give them 2 months' rations, the condition being that each one of the sectarians would have to sign for them on the invoice. Of course, they refused. At this point, the indefatigable Anna Skripnikova intervened. Notwithstanding her own youth and the youth of the Soviet government, she had already been arrested for the 4th time. She dashed back and forth between the accounting office, the work assigners, and the chief of the camp himself, who was engaged in putting into effect the humanitarian regimen. She first besought compassion for them, and after that she begged to be sent to the Zayatsky Islands with the sectarians as their clerk, undertaking the obligation of issuing food to them each day, and conducting all the bookkeeping formalities for them. And it would appear that this didn't conflict in any respect with the camp system, and the chiefs refused. "But they feed insane people without asking for signatures on receipts," Anna cried. Zarin only burst out laughing, and a woman work assigner replied, "Maybe those are Moscow's orders, we don't really know." Of course they were instructions from Moscow, for who else would have taken the responsibility? And so they were sent off without food. 2 months later, exactly 2 months, because they were then to be asked to sign for their food for the next 2 months, they sailed over to Malizayatsky and found only corpses, which had been picked by the birds. Everyone was there. No one had escaped. So who now is going to seek out those guilty in the 60s of our great century? Anyway, Zarin, too, was soon removed from his post for liberalism, and it seems he got 10 years himself. From the end of the 20s, the face of the Solovetsky camp changed. From a silent trap for the doomed KRs, it was transformed increasingly into the then new, but to us old, species of generalized ITL, or corrective labor camp. The number of especially dangerous criminals from among the workers multiplied rapidly in the nation, and they herded the non-political offenders and hoodlums to Solovki. Both veteran thieves and beginning thieves landed on Solovki. A big wave of women thieves and prostitutes poured in, and when they encountered each other at the Chem transit camp, the women thieves yelled at the prostitutes, "We may steal, but we don't sell ourselves," and the prostitutes shouted back, "We sell what belongs to us, not stolen goods." The fact of the matter was that a war against prostitution had been proclaimed throughout the country, not in the newspapers, of course, and so they rounded them all up in all the big cities and pasted a standard 3 years on all of them and drove many of them to Solovki. In theory, it was quite clear that honest labor would swiftly reform them. However, for some reason, they clung stubbornly to their socially humiliating profession, and while en route they asked to be allowed to wash floors in the convoy's guards' barracks, and seduced the Red Army men, subverting the statutes of the convoy service. And they made friends just as easily with the jailers, not for free, of course. They arranged things even better for themselves on Solovetsky, which was so starved for women. They were allotted the best rooms in the living quarters, and every day new clothes and gifts were brought them, and the so-called nuns and the other KR women earned money by working for them, embroidering their underthings. And on completion of their terms, rich as never before, with suitcases full of silks, they returned home to begin an honest life. And the thieves spent their time playing cards, and the women thieves found it useful to bear children on Solovetsky. There were no nurseries, and by having a child they could get themselves released from work for their whole short term. The KR women who preceded them had refused to take this way out. On March the 12th, 1929, the first group of juveniles arrived at Solovetsky, and from then on they kept sending them, all of them under 16. At first they were quartered in the children's colony near the Kremlin with those same showpiece cots and mattresses. They hid their government-issue clothing and shouted that they had nothing to go out to work in. And then they, too, were sent off to logging, from which they fled, switching all their names and their terms, and they had to be caught and thereupon sorted out all over again. With the arrival of a socially healthy contingent of prisoners, the cultural and educational section came to life. They campaigned for the liquidation of illiteracy, but the thieves had not the slightest problem in telling the difference between clubs and hearts. They posted a slogan, "A prisoner is an active participant in socialist construction," and they even thought up a term for it, too, reforging. It was here that this term was invented. In September 1930 came the appeal of the Central Committee to all workers for the development of socialist competition and the shock worker movement. And how could the prisoners not be included? If free people everywhere were being harnessed up, then wasn't it also necessary to put the prisoners between the shafts? From here on, our information comes not from living people, but from the book of the scholar-jurist Averbach. And therefore we suggest that the reader may wish to divide this information by 16, or maybe by 256. And sometimes it even needs to be taken in a reverse sense. In the autumn of 1930, there was created a Solovetsky staff for socialist competition and the shock worker movement. Inveterate repeaters, murderers, and cutthroats suddenly emerged in the role of economy-minded managers, skilled technical directors, and capable cultural workers. G. Andreev recalls, "They used to scream in one's face, 'Come across with your norm, you KR.' The thieves and bandits had no sooner read the appeal of the Central Committee than they threw away their knives and their playing cards and simply burned with thirst to create a commune. They wrote into the statutes that the social origin of members must be either poor or middle-level peasant families or the working class, and it need be said that all the thieves were registered in the records and classifications section as former workers, so that Shevchinsky's former slogan almost came true, 'Solovetsky for the workers and peasants.' And on no account would 58s be admitted. And the commune members also proposed that all their prison terms be added together and divided by their number so as to arrive at an average term, and that on its expiration they should all be freed simultaneously. But notwithstanding the communist character of this proposal, the Chekists considered it politically premature. The slogan of the Solovetsky Commune was, 'Let us pay our debt to the working class,' and even better was the one, 'From us, everything, to us, nothing.' This particular slogan, which was fully mature, was probably worthy of all-union dissemination. And here is the ferocious penalty they thought up to punish members of the commune who were guilty of infractions, to forbid them to go out to work. Now, it would be quite hard to find a stiffer punishment for a thief than that. Nonetheless, the Solovetsky administration, which was not about to go as far as the cultural and educational officials, did not base its faith too heavily on the thieves' enthusiasm, but instead applied the Leninist principle, shock work, shock maintenance. What this meant was that the commune members were moved into separate barracks where they got softer bedding, warmer clothing, and were fed separately and better, at the expense of all the rest of the prisoners, of course. The commune members liked this very much, and for the purpose of keeping all their fellow members in the commune, they established the rule that there would be no more expulsions from it. This sort of commune was also very popular among non-commune members, and they all applied for admission to the commune. However, it was decided not to take them into the commune, but to create second, third, and fourth labor collectives, which would not have all those privileges. And in any case, the 58s were not accepted in any of the collectives, even though in the newspaper the most impudent of the hoodlums instructed the 58s. It's time, really it's time, to grasp that camp is a school for labor. And the reports were flown by plane to Gulag headquarters. Miracles at Solovetsky, a turbulent turning point in the attitude of the thieves. All the passion of the criminal world had been redirected into shock work, socialist competition, fulfillment of the production and financial plan. And in Gulag they were suitably astonished, and they broadcast the results of the experiment. And that is how Solovetsky began to live. Part of the camp was in the labor collectives, and their percentage of plan fulfillment had not simply risen, but doubled. And the cultural and educational section explained this by the influence of the collective. But we know what it was, common garden variety camp padding of worksheets, tuchta. I have been reproached with spelling this word incorrectly, and told that it should be written as it is correctly pronounced in thieves' jargon, tufta. For tuchta is the peasants' assimilation of it, just like Fyodor for Fyodor. But I like it. Tuchta is somehow akin to the Russian language, while tufta is totally alien. The thieves brought it, but the whole Russian people learned it. So let it be tuchta. The other part of the camp, the unorganized part, yes, and also underfed and underdressed, and engaged in the heaviest work, failed, as one can well understand, to fulfill its work norms. In February 1931, a conference of Solovetsky shock brigades decreed a broad wave of socialist competition to answer the new slander of the capitalists about forced labor in the USSR. In March, there were already 136 shock brigades, and suddenly in April their general liquidation was decreed because a hostile class element had permeated the collectives for the purpose of causing them to disintegrate. Now, there's a riddle for you. The 58s were not allowed across the threshold, and so who was it who was causing them to disintegrate? What we have to understand is that the tuchta had been uncovered. They had eaten and drunk and made merry, they had counted things up, shed a few tears, and taken the whip to some so the rest would get moving. And the joyous hubbub gave way to the noiseless dispatch of the prisoner transports. The 58s were being sent from the Solovetsky mother tumor to far-off fatal places to open up new camps there. Chapter 3. The Archipelago metastasizes. Well, the archipelago did not develop on its own, but side by side with the whole country. As long as there was unemployment in the nation, there was no feverish demand for prisoner manpower, and arrests took place not as a means of mobilizing labor, but as a means of sweeping clean the road. But when the concept arose of stirring up the whole 180 million with an enormous mixing paddle, when the plan for super-industrialization was rejected in favor of the plan for super-industrialization, when the liquidation of the kulak was already foreseen along with the massive public works of the first 5-year plan, on the eve of the year of the great fracture, the view of the archipelago and everything in the archipelago changed too. On March the 26th, 1928, the Council of People's Commissars, meaning it was still under the chairmanship of Rykov, conducted a review of the status of penal policy in the nation and of conditions in places of imprisonment. In regard to penal policy, it was admitted that it was inadequate, and it was decreed that harsh measures of repression should be applied to class enemies and hostile class elements, that the camp regimen should be made more severe, and that socially unstable elements should not be given terms at all. And, in addition, forced labor should be set up in such a way that the prisoner should not earn anything from his work, but that the state should derive economic profit from it, and to consider it necessary from now on to expand the capacity of labor colonies. In other words, putting it simply, it was proposed that more camps be prepared in anticipation of the abundant arrests planned. Trotsky also had foreseen this same economic necessity, except that he again proposed that a labor army be created by the compulsory drafting of people. The horseradish is no sweeter than the black radish. But whether out of a spirit of opposition to his eternal rival, or whether in order to cut people off more decisively from the possibility of complaint and hope of return, Stalin decided to process the labor army men through the prison machinery. Throughout the nation, unemployment was abolished, and the economic rationale for expansion of the camps appeared. Back in 1923, no more than 3,000 persons had been imprisoned on Solovki, and by 1930 there were already about 50,000, yes, and another 30,000 in Kem. In 1928, the Solovetsky cancer began to creep outward, first through Karelia on road-building projects, and in logging for export. Just as willingly, SLON began to sell its engineers. They went off without convoy to work in any northern locality, and their wages were credited to the camp. By 1929, SLON camp sites had already appeared at all points on the Murmansk Railroad, from Lodey-Noye Pole to Tybola. From there, the movement continued along the Vologda Railroad, and so active was it that at Zvanka station it proved necessary to open up a SLON transport control center. By 1930, Svirag had already grown strong in Lodey-Noye Pole and stood on its own legs, and in Kotlas-Kotlag had already been formed. In 1931, Belbatlag had been born, with its center in Medvezhyagorsk, which was destined over the next 2 years to bring glory to the archipelago for eternity, and on 5 continents. This was the official date, but in actual fact it had been there since 1930, though its organizational period had been kept secret to give the impression of rapid work, for bragging, and for history. Here, too, was Tukhta. And the malignant cells kept on creeping and creeping. They were blocked on one side by the sea and on the other by the Finnish border, but there was nothing to hinder the founding of a camp near Krasnaya Vishera in 1929. And the main thing was that all the paths to the east through the Russian north lay open and unobstructed. Very soon the Soroka-Kotlas road was reaching out. "We'll complete Soroka ahead of Sroka," ahead of term. The Solovetsky prisoners used to make fun of S. Alimov, who nonetheless stuck to his last and made his name as a poet and songwriter. Creeping on the northern Dvina River, the camp cells formed Sevdvinlag. Crossing it, they fearlessly marched on the Urals. By 1931, the Northern Urals Department of SLON was founded, which soon gave rise to the independent Solikamlag and Sevuralag. The Berezniki camp began the construction of a big chemical combine, which in its time was much publicized. In the summer of 1929, an expedition of unconvoyed prisoners was sent to the Chibyu River from Solovki, under the leadership of the geologist M.V. Rushchinsky, in order to prospect for petroleum, which had been discovered there as far back as the 80s of the 19th century. The expedition was successful, and a camp was set up on the Ukhta, Ukhtlag. But it, too, did not stand still on its own spot, but quickly metastasized to the northeast, annexed the Pechora, and was transformed into Ukhtpechlag. Soon afterward, it had its Ukhta, Inta, Pechora, and Vorkuta sections, all of them the bases of great independent future camps. We are giving dates and places equal weight, but beg the reader to bear in mind that all this was gotten through questioning people and comparing, so there may be omissions and errors. The opening up of so expansive a roadless northern region as this required the building of a railroad from Kotlas via Knyazhpogost and Ropcha to Vorkuta. This called forth the need for 2 more independent camps, which were railroad-building camps. Sevzheldorlag, on the sector from Kotlas to the Pechora River, and Petrolag, not to be confused with the industrial Ukhtpechlag, on the sector from the Pechora River to Vorkuta.